Hi, everybody. Tonight we begin a long and quiet journey into a chapter of our shared human past that very few speak of, but once heard, it lingers in the mind like a distant shadow cast by ancient flames. This is the story of the year 536, often called the worst year to be alive. But rather than bombard you with sharp facts or sudden horrors, we will take it slowly, letting the fog of time settle gently as we explore not only what happened, but how it must have felt to live through it. We will walk beside imagined souls of the time, humble farmers, wandering monks, watchful kings, and quiet children, and listen to the silence that fell across the earth when the skies dimmed and the sun refused to shine. This is not just the history of disaster, but the quiet human story wrapped inside it. Let's begin. The year had not yet begun with any ill omen. In the eastern valleys of the Roman Empire, what we now call the Byzantine world, winter had passed in its ordinary hush. The snows melted along the riverbanks, and the birds began to return to bare branches with their usual songs. In the mountain village of Sarnaxos, nestled between ridges of dry rock and scattered olive trees, an old man named Leontius rose before dawn each day. His knees cracked beneath him, and his breath came like wind through reeds, but he walked slowly among his goats, whispering the same prayers his father had taught him. He didn't know, nor did anyone, that the spring of that year would not come. On the morning that should have begun the planting season, the air carried a strange stillness. Leontius noticed it first in the breath of the wind. It smelled of ash, faint and high, like burnt wood carried from some distant land. The sky, too, had changed. It wasn't dark, but dulled, as though the heavens had been brushed with smoke and would not clear. The sun rose, but only barely. Its light sickened into a dim orange that failed to warm the skin. By midday, the village remained in a twilight gloom. At first, no one spoke of it. The villagers were accustomed to strange seasons. There had been floods before and droughts that curled the wheat. But this felt different. The children noticed it most, how their shadows no longer followed them, how even at noon, the world wore the colors of dusk. In Constantinople, hundreds of miles to the west, whispers began to move through the streets. Scholars at the imperial court stared skyward, unsure whether the dimming sun was a celestial warning or a mere trick of weather. The Emperor Justinian, wise and proud, summoned his advisors. Among them was a Syrian philosopher named Johannes, a man of silence and ink, who studied stars and scripts with equal care. He came before the court with a small scroll, trembling in his hand. "It is not a passing cloud," he said softly. "The sun has grown weak." No one knew then what caused it. Not Leontius in his mountains, nor the emperor in his marble halls. But across the world, from Ireland to India, from China to the high steppes, the same darkness was settling. By midsummer, it was clear something was deeply wrong. The crops, which should have risen with green joy, lay shrunken in brittle fields. Rain fell but did not nourish. Streams flowed but seemed choked of their usual clarity. Even the birds sang less often. Hunger began not as panic but as a slow confusion. In Sarnaxos, Leontius's neighbors started coming to him more frequently, asking if his goats had stopped giving milk or if the earth beneath his garden had turned hard. He offered them what little he had, and still the sun remained dim. In the monastery of Mount Sinai, cloistered far from cities, a young scribe named Aias kept a record of the days. His duty was to mark the weather, the seasons, and the rhythms of liturgical life. His parchment entries turned from calm to troubled. "On the day of St. Cassian, the light was absent," he wrote. And again, on the feast of St. Marcellus, the dawn came with no warmth. His entries grew shorter as the day colder, as if the ink itself grew reluctant. What they could not know, what no man at the time could guess, was that a volcano, perhaps in Iceland or perhaps further east, had erupted with such fury that its smoke had curled into the stratosphere, blanketing the sky. The earth was shrouded not by night, but by an eerie pall that blunted light and chilled the air. The sun, weakened by this invisible veil, could no longer perform its ancient task. Famine began in whispers. In the fields beyond Ravenna, a woman named Althea buried her son beneath a crumbling fig tree. He had stopped eating days earlier, his limbs too thin, his eyes vacant. She did not weep. Her tears had long dried. Her neighbors helped her dig the shallow grave and then returned in silence to their own quiet misery. By autumn, The darkness had become ordinary. No one spoke of when the sun might return. They instead spoke of saints and angels, of sins that might have caused it, of prophecies murmured in forgotten texts. Across the empire, candles were lit earlier each day. Markets stood half empty. Bread cost more than some could earn in a week. In cities, beggars filled alleyways and priests held processions, carrying relics through streets draped in gray. In the east, in the lands beyond the Euphrates, a dust storm swallowed the horizon for 12 days. Nomads wandered without direction, their camels dying, their water fouled. Some believed it was the day of judgment. Others said the old gods were at war. And yet, amidst all this, life continued in its stubborn way. Leontius, though thinner now, still rose each day. He still walked among his goats and whispered his prayers, though they had grown quieter. Aius, the young monk, still dipped his pen ink and wrote of the twilight days. And in Constantinople, the emperor still ruled, though his court had grown anxious, his city restless. The world had dimmed, but no one yet knew how long it would last, or how much darker it could become. In the weeks that followed, the veil over the sun did not lift. The people no longer waited for its brightness as they once did. They learned to live beneath a sky that glowed dimly like tarnished bronze. Fires were lit during midday in hearths and workshops. Candles flickered through homes like stars that had descended to earth, their soft light barely enough to chase away the growing gloom. In Constantinople, the marketplace had changed. Once vibrant with colors and loud with the cries of traders and fishmongers, it had turned into something quieter, more desperate. Merchants sold what little remained beneath canopies that sagged from damp air, and fewer coins changed hands. The price of wheat had doubled, then tripled. Bread, once a staple offered to all, became rare in the mouths of the poor. In the midst of the Hannes, the philosopher who served at the emperor's side, spent his nights studying old texts. He no longer believed this was a temporary darkness. He wrote quietly to scholars in Alexandria, Antioch, and Athens, hoping that somewhere, someone had seen this before. The letters were sent with care, but some never reached their destination. Roads were less safe now, and riders less willing to journey far in the creeping cold. Leontius, in his mountain village, had begun to ration what remained in his root cellar. The goats, once his pride, grew thin. One died in the night, its legs curled beneath it like folded parchment. He buried it near the edge of his garden and sat beside the grave until the chill of the ground rose into his bones. He thought of his daughter, long gone to a far city, and wondered if she had food. He whispered her name into the wind, though no one heard. To the north, in the forests of Gaul, a quiet family of woodcutters lived in a clearing by the river. The father, Gervais, had taught his children to watch the sky for storms. But now the sky held no shape. Each day passed under the same pale shroud, and the forest grew silent. Fewer birds sang. The trees, though still standing, had leaves that yellowed too early and fell too soon. The ground beneath them, once fertile, was damp and bitter. His wife Eleanor began boiling moss and bark to make broth. It smelled earthy and strange, but it kept their bellies from gnawing at their ribs. Their youngest son, Lucian, asked why the sun was gone. Gervais had no answer. He placed his hand gently on the boy's head and said only, "It's resting, for a while." In Ireland, the monks of Clonmacnoise recorded the light as though it were a rare visitor. On the feast of St. Saran, one entry read, the day was like dusk. The sun glowed red behind veils, as though ashamed to shine. The abbey grew quieter. Fewer travelers arrived, pilgrims stayed away. Even the bees that once filled the gardens with hum and life had disappeared. And yet the monks prayed. Their voices rose through the chapel like wind through reeds, soft and unwavering. They prayed for the return of the light, for mercy upon the land, and for the strength to endure. One brother, a young man named Fiacre, began carving a small chronicle into wood. Each day he etched a new mark into the beam above his cot. By mid-autumn, the beam was nearly full. In the east, across the Persian lands, the Zoroastrian priests looked skyward and trembled. The sacred fire within their temples, which was never allowed to die, seemed pale. Some whispered that the eternal light of Ahura Mazda had turned its face away. Crops along the Tigris wilted. Herds grew restless. The priests performed long ceremonies, scattering sacred herbs into the flames. But the sky did not change. Along the Nile, farmers watched as the river swelled with strange irregularity. Some years it came too high, drowning fields. This year it came late, and it came gray. Silt clung to reeds like soot. The earth drank the water but did not bear fruit. In Thebes, a boy named Horemheb listened as his grandmother, toothless and bent like a cane, whispered of the time before. The sun was once like gold, she told him. You should have seen it. He stared at the sky, hoping to remember a color he had never known. As winter approached, it did not wait patiently at the edge of the year. It came early, sudden and raw. The cold was unlike anything in memory. In Italy, snow fell in places it had never touched before. The wind carried a bitter taste as though it had passed through death. Fires burned low in hearths because there was little wood to spare. People wrapped themselves in straw, old cloth, and hope. Leontius, now almost entirely alone in his village, closed off rooms in his cottage to keep the warmth in. He huddled beside the fire with his remaining goat, now more bone than beast, and whispered stories of summers long ago. He could still remember the heat of a southern sun on his shoulders, the laughter of children chasing each other through the groves. That warmth felt like something from another world. In the cities, sickness followed the hunger. Bodies weakened by months of poor food and poor sleep became easy prey for illness. In Antioch, fevers swept through the narrow alleys. In Rome, the scent of decay lingered behind every corner. Priests walked with incense, not for ceremony, but to mask the stench of the dying. The dead were buried quickly, and not always with names. Still, the world moved. Boats crossed darkened seas. Letters continued to travel, even if they arrived late. Songs were still sung, quieter now, often as lullabies to children who shivered beneath thin blankets. People still married, still prayed, still looked to the horizon each morning, hoping for the light to change. But the sun remained dim, the sky remained closed, and the year 536 wore on, slow as shadow and heavy as ash. The cold settled deeper as the final days of the year approached. It clung not only to the air, but to the marrow of life itself. In many places it felt as though time had slowed. Each day another echo of the last, each moment colored in the same dull gray. The sun, when it rose, brought no cheer. It hovered like a smudge in the sky, pale and reluctant. And across villages, forests, and cities alike, people no longer asked when the sun would return. They asked if it ever would. In the foothills of the Carpathians, a girl named Mirella waited for her father's return. He had left before first frost, taking the family's last sack of millet to trade in the valley town. She and her mother lived in a small wooden house near a frozen creek, surrounded by bare trees that whispered in the wind. Mirella had grown used to silence, but now even her thoughts seemed to hush. Her mother kept the hearth burning with whatever wood she could find. Fallen branches, furniture, even old tools. They boiled nettles and dried mushrooms, not for flavor, but to fill the space in their stomachs. Mirella's fingers had become thin and stiff, her nails pale and cracked. Still, each morning, she opened the door and looked to the path, hoping to see her father's figure appear through the mist. Each day he did not return. Far to the south, in the hills of Cilicia, a caravan passed through a pass dusted in snow. The traders, men from Tyre, Edessa, and beyond, traveled in near silence. The road, once bustling with merchants and pilgrims, now felt like the corridor of some forgotten tomb. The sky above them gave no hint of time. Day and night blended together in a haze of twilight. Among the travelers was a man named Sergios, a former soldier turned cloth seller. His mule carried little, a few rolls of linen and some dried figs. He had once traded in silks and spices, but the market had crumbled. People no longer bought fine garments, they bought warmth. And when they could not afford it, they stole it. Sergios watched the road carefully. Once he feared bandits, now he feared finding no one at all. In the quiet coastal towns of Britannia, the sea no longer shimmered as it had in memory. Its surface looked like lead, and its waves moved slowly as if heavy with sorrow. Fishing boats returned half empty or not at all. The fish had become strange, smaller, sometimes discolored, often absent from their usual grounds. On the Isle of Thanet, a woman named Iseult tended to her sick husband. He coughed through the night, wrapped in every piece of cloth they owned. She sang softly to him, not because she expected him to sleep, but because silence made the darkness heavier. She remembered stories from her mother about winters past, But none had ever been like this. Her garden had died before harvest. The fruit trees bore nothing, and the sky, always the sky, remained dim. At the monastery of Monte Cassino, the monks turned increasingly to their manuscripts as though they might read their way into an answer. They copied not just holy texts, but now also accounts of what they witnessed. Brother Amatis began keeping a second book, hidden beneath his robes, in which he wrote with plain words. "The sun is shamed," he penned. "It watches but does not warm. The people murmur of curses. I wonder if God has turned his face from us." But still the brothers prayed. Their bells rang each morning, though it was difficult to tell when morning began. Their chants rose into the cold air, unhurried and solemn. The rhythm of monastic life had not changed, even if the world around them had. And somehow, that sameness became a comfort, a proof that something still endured. In the markets of Alexandria, the philosophers debated, was this the end of an age? Was the world cooling before a new birth, or collapsing into ruin? Some blamed comets, others the wrath of God. A few, quiet and grave, spoke of volcanic fire in distant lands, but none could be sure. What was certain was that famine was no longer a shadow in the distance. It was real, and it was here. In the Germanic villages along the Rhine, people began to leave their homes in search of food. Some traveled in small groups, hollow-eyed and silent. Others banded together, forming desperate camps in forests or along half-frozen rivers. The roads grew dangerous, not from war, but from hunger. Even the most peaceful among them began to carry blades. Children grew quiet. Their games stopped. They no longer chased each other through fields or sang songs in the twilight. They watched their elders with wide, serious eyes, absorbing the silence like sponges absorb rain. They learned quickly when not to ask questions. In Sarnaxos, Leontius now found himself completely alone. The last of his neighbors had gone down the valley weeks earlier, hoping to reach the coast. He stayed, partly from age, partly from habit, and partly because he believed it was not yet time to die. He tended his fire with reverence. He sat beside it for hours, watching the flames dance and fade. He had stopped counting the days. Time had become strange, long and narrow, like a river seen from far above. One morning, without knowing why, he took a walk beyond the village. The sky was heavy with gray, but he walked until he reached the olive grove where he had once played as a boy. The trees were bare, their bark cracked with cold. He placed his hand on the trunk of one and whispered to it. He didn't expect it to answer, but it felt right somehow to speak. In the eastern mountains of Armenia, a shepherd named Arshak built a shrine of stones. He had lost half his flock, and his brothers had not returned from the lowlands. He no longer prayed for rescue. He prayed only for the world to stop fading. Each evening, he lit a small flame in the shrine and watched it flicker against the stones. He told himself that if the fire still burned, there was still some warmth left in the world. And though many had died, more still lived. They endured each twilight day. They shared what they had. They carried water. They sang old songs. They lit candles, and they remembered what light had once felt like. Even in the darkest hours, a few still believed that it might return. But deep within the clouds that circled the globe, the ash still hung. The air still moved thick and cold. The sun still looked down, pale and unsure. And the year, though nearing its end, gave no promise of renewal. By the time the year turned, there was no celebration. The passing of 536 into 537 came not with the ringing of bells or the lighting of lamps, but in silence. No one marked the change. The days remained the same, dim, cold, and drawn out like the tolling of a slow, distant bell. It was a new year in name alone. In every other sense, it was simply a continuation of the dark. In Constantinople, the city still stood, but something had shifted within it. Its walls, once symbols of invincibility, now echoed with the sound of prayers and coughing. The Grand Hagia Sophia remained a place of worship, but also a shelter. Families huddled beneath its arches, wrapped in shawls and shivering quietly. The incense could not mask the odor of hunger. Emperor Justinian, once radiant in his robes of gold and purple, had grown more shadowed. His court had shrunk, his counselors quieter. Even Johannes, the scholar whose eyes had once gleamed with the light of knowledge, now moved more slowly, his scrolls growing dusty. He spent his days translating fragments of older histories, tales of famines past, skies darkened by omens, years when kingdoms rose only to be swallowed by frost. There is precedent, he whispered to no one in particular, but never this long, never this deep. In the valley of Artois, the snow returned. It did not melt. The rivers moved beneath a skin of ice, slow as dreams. The peasants could no longer dig into the soil. It was frozen too deeply. Entire communities abandoned their land, traveling west in search of softer ground, of some patch of earth not yet choked by cold. Along the roads, they carried what they could: blankets, wooden spoons, memories. Among them was a man named Renaud, who had once been a baker. His wife had died in the early frost, and he now traveled with his sister's 2 children. They spoke little. The boy, barely 5, carried a small toy horse carved from birch. He no longer played with it, but he would not let it go. At night they built small fires with twigs and prayed for the wind to pass over them. Renaud told the children stories of summers when bread was golden and warm, of days when birdsong woke the morning. He told them of a sun that glowed like an orange jewel in the sky. The children listened, eyes wide, as though hearing of a distant fairyland. In the village of Dunwich, perched on England's east coast, the sea had become more restless. Storms came more often now, rolling in with dark clouds and wind that howled like wolves. The cliffs began to crumble in places, and the people muttered that the land itself was retreating. The fishermen refused to go out. The waves brought back wreckage, bits of other boats, ropes torn and tangled, driftwood shaped like bones. Old Mother Sinrig, the village healer, wrapped seaweed around her legs to keep them warm. She brewed teas from dried roots and told tales of the old gods, the ones who came before Rome, who lived in stones and streams. Some came to her in secret, asking for charms. Others just came to listen. Her cottage, damp and crooked, became a place of quiet gathering. She told them, "The earth breathes slowly now. We must match its pace." In the highlands beyond Antioch, the shepherds could no longer graze their flocks. The grass had turned brittle, and the winds carried dust that settled into the lungs. One by one, the animals died, and then the people began to fall ill, first with chills, then fevers, then silence. Small villages disappeared, their doors left open, their wells frozen. At the monastery of St. Simeon, the bell no longer rang at sunrise. There was no sunrise to measure by. The monks kept their rituals by hourglass and candle. Brother Orestes, who once sang with a voice that echoed down the cloister halls, now could barely whisper. He had taken to writing poetry by the light of a single lamp, lines that seemed to drift like dust on the air. The world is dim, but not yet dead. A flame may sleep and still be fed. He left the scraps of parchment tucked between stones in the chapel wall. In the forests of the Russ, strange things began to happen. The animals, foxes, deer, even wolves, moved closer to human settlements, not with aggression, but desperation. One morning, in a small wooden village on the edge of the trees, a bear wandered into the square and collapsed beside the well. It did not rise again. The villagers buried it with reverence, laying pine branches over its massive form. Some whispered that the spirits of the forest were starving. The village elder, an old man named Yaroslav, gathered the people by firelight. "This is a test," he said, "not of strength, but of kindness. If we are not kind now, we will become like the forest, silent and cold." In Jerusalem, the temples remained open. The pilgrims had stopped coming, but the priests still lit the candles, still swept the floors. The wind carried dust from the deserts, dust that did not settle. It lingered in the corners of every room, in the folds of every robe. One young acolyte, Ezra, had never seen the holy city in sunlight. He had been born in the dark year. To him, the world had always looked like this, gray and waiting. He asked his teacher, "Did the sun ever shine through the windows?" The old man smiled gently and said, "Yes, and it will again." But even as he spoke the words, his hands trembled. And yet, despite all, the world endured. In pockets and corners, lights still flickered. Stories were still told. Songs were still sung, even if softly. People still loved, still hoped. The darkness was vast, but it was not complete. There were stars above the clouds, even if unseen. And in the earth, beneath the frozen soil, seeds still slept, waiting for the warmth to return. The spring of 537 came and went unnoticed by most. It did not bring with it the usual signs of rebirth. There were no buds on the trees, no chirping of returning birds, no soft breezes carrying the smell of new grass. The land remained still, hushed and gray. If it was spring, it was only in name. The people no longer looked to the calendar. They looked to the ground, to the sky, to each other's faces, searching for something that might mark a turning. In a narrow valley near the Black Sea, a widow named Alinka lived alone in a hut made of woven reeds and clay. Her husband had died 2 winters before, but she had stayed, not out of hope, but habit. She spoke little and sang to herself when she worked, a lullaby she barely remembered learning. Her breath came in small clouds each morning, and her footsteps left marks in frost even in what should have been May. Alinka had once tended a garden of herbs and roots. Now, the soil was dry and dusted with ash. She sat beside it in silence each day, her hands resting on her lap, palms up as if waiting to receive something from the sky. She did not speak to others. The nearest neighbor was more than a mile away, and there were days when even birds would not visit. Still, she stayed, keeping a small fire alive and pressing dried leaves into a book she could no longer read. Each leaf was a memory of greener times. In Constantinople, illness had taken a new shape. It had begun quietly, as all things did in those years. Just a few cases, a few whispered reports of fever. Then the coughing began, then the swellings. Within weeks it was clear that something worse than famine or frost had arrived. The physicians spoke of a new plague, one that seemed to strike without warning and spared few. The streets that had once carried the shuffle of hungry feet now echoed with the creak of carts bearing the dead. The air smelled of damp linen, herbs, and despair. The Emperor Justinian himself fell ill. His palace grew quiet, his halls filled with the mutterings of servants who feared the worst. The city braced, breathless, but Justinian lived. Somehow, through the fever and pain, he emerged, weak, pale, but breathing. It was said he had dreamt of fire and of angels, that he had heard the voice of a saint guiding him back. No one knew if this was true, but people clung to the story like a rope in rising water. Johannes, the philosopher, had not been so fortunate. He died in the 3rd week of the sickness, his notes left scattered around his chamber, half-finished translations and thoughts never to be completed. The candles on his desk burned low and were not replaced. Dust soon covered his work. In the hills of Tuscany, a group of women had formed what they called the Circle of the Ember. They did not claim to be healers nor priests, but they gathered weekly to light a single, carefully guarded flame and speak the names of those who had been lost. They sang in low voices, their melodies drawn from lullabies and old pagan chants. Some came from nearby villages, others from afar. They carried small offerings, dried berries, feathers, folded scraps of parchment. Their leader, a quiet woman named Leticia, had once been a midwife. She no longer helped bring life into the world. She now watched over those preparing to leave it. But the circle did not weep. They focused not on death, but on warmth. The warmth of a memory, the glow of a candle, the brush of a hand in darkness. Their gatherings brought no change to the sky, but those who attended often left with lighter hearts. In the north, beyond the lands of the Franks, the forest tribes turned inward. They had stopped venturing far from their hearths, and their winter supplies, once carefully stored, had long since vanished. In some places, people turned to bark and boiled leather. In others, they took darker turns. Whispers of theft and worse traveled between trees like wind. Yet in one village, deep in the pines, a child named Aldwin found a sapling that had begun to grow near a half-frozen spring. It was small, barely a hand's length, but it was green. He knelt beside it every day, brushing away snow and bringing melted water in a broken horn. He never spoke of it, not even to his parents, as though sharing it might break the spell. When he looked at the sapling, something stirred in his chest, an unfamiliar thing, thin and flickering. In Baghdad, the scholars gathered in the House of Wisdom, though many of its rooms had grown empty. Some had fled the sickness. Others had simply vanished, lost to the cold or to silence. The remaining learned men copied texts not only from Greece and Persia, but from what they now began calling the Dark Years, records of this time in their own hand, hoping that someone someday might read them. One such scholar, Khalid ibn Masud, began mapping the reports of the strange sun. He drew charts, marked dates, plotted stars. His fingers were cracked from the cold, and he wrote with gloves on. But he worked with the urgency of a man trying to leave a message in a bottle. At night, he stared into the black sky, searching for movement, for signs, for meaning. Back in the highlands of Armenia, Arshak's shrine had grown. Others had come, one by one, drawn by the sight of its flickering fire. They added stones, brought tokens, left prayers scrawled on parchment and bone. The flame never went out. Even in the wind and frost, Arshak tended it. Some called it a miracle. He did not. He only said, "The fire stays alive because we do." The world had changed so slowly that many had stopped noticing. But now, a quiet shift had begun. In some corners, the air no longer tasted of ash. A few shepherds reported that their goats had birthed healthy kids. A monk near Carthage saw a patch of green among brown hills and marked it with a cross on his walking stick. In Iceland, where the sky had once burned, the ash rains had lessened, but the sun remained hidden. The days were still dim, and the memories of hunger, sickness, and silence lingered like cold smoke on the breath. Still, people waited, not idly, but with the kind of patience that only suffering can teach. They watched the sky. They held each other's hands. They lit fires and whispered to them, asking for another day. Along the salt-swept coast of the Aegean, the fishermen of a village called Theros returned to the sea for the first time in many months. Their boats, patched with rope and tar, had sat unused for a season too long. The sea itself had been restless, offering little in return to those who braved it. But something in the wind had changed, just faintly. It no longer bit with the same bitterness. The waves, though still gray, no longer roared quite so loud. One of the fishermen, a wiry man named Nikitas, had grown gaunt but not yet bowed. He was the first to push his boat from the sand, watched by silent neighbors who made no move to stop him. He rowed slowly, his arms remembering the rhythm of work that had once shaped his every day. His net, mended more times than he could count, dragged behind him like a memory. That morning, he caught a single silver fish. It was not enough to feed a family, but it was more than anyone had pulled from the sea in weeks. The village gathered quietly around him as he returned. They did not cheer. They only looked and nodded, and someone lit a fire. That night, they shared the fish, passing slivers from hand to hand like communion. It was not the meal that mattered. It was the act of gathering. Far inland, where the river Euphrates wound like a spine through the bone-dry hills, a traveling monk named Zosimos walked from village to village, speaking quietly to the old and the young. He carried with him no food, no bedroll, only a small wooden cross and a satchel of scrolls. His robe was worn through at the hem, and his sandals had long since fallen apart. He offered no cures, no blessings, only words. In a town where the wells had run shallow and children no longer played outside, he stood in the square and told a story of a tree that grew from stone. He spoke of patience, of waiting with dignity, of suffering as a kind of prayer. The people said little, but when he left the next morning, someone had placed a handful of almonds in his satchel. And when he reached the next village, there were already whispers waiting for him. North of the Alps, the forest stirred with the first true thaw. It was not dramatic, no sudden burst of green, no flurry of blossoms. But in the underbrush, small shoots pressed upward. The moss regained a touch of color. A squirrel darted across a tree limb. These were small things, and many did not notice, but a few did. In a wooden hall near the Danube, a chieftain's daughter named Brida watched the thaw with suspicion. She had lost 3 brothers to the long winter. Her people had turned thin and grim. The fire in the central hearth had never gone out, but it had flickered low more often than not. Yet now she stood outside, fur cloak drawn tight, watching the river slowly awaken. She had dreamt days before of a stag with glowing antlers leading her through a field of wheat. She told no one. But in her silence, she began carving the image into the hilt of her knife. To the east, in a mountain village where even the names had begun to fade from maps, a boy named Timur lit a small lantern for the first time in weeks. His father, who had once mined iron from the hills, now lay too weak to speak. But when Timur brought the lantern into the room, the light flickering gold against the soot-streaked walls, his father opened his eyes. He said only, "It is like a star." Timur held the lantern higher and nodded. He stayed beside his father that night, listening to the wind outside. It still carried chill, but it no longer howled. In the morning, Timur stepped outside and saw that the frost on the ground had melted just enough to reveal the dark, damp earth beneath. And in Jerusalem, where so many prayers had been whispered into stone, the air had shifted. The priests noticed it first, though they said nothing. The scent of the candles burned in the temple was different, less like smoke, more like warmth. A blind beggar who sat at the gate claimed he could feel sunlight on his face for the first time in over a year. Few believed him, but they dropped coins into his cup nonetheless. The old acolyte Ezra, now a year older and deeper in his voice, stood each morning by the archway and looked eastward. He saw no great light, but the grayness had lifted slightly. He could now distinguish clouds from sky, a shape from a blur. He began to count again, not the days, but the birds. 2 pigeons, 5 sparrows, 1 hawk circling above the rooftops. In the deep south of Egypt, near the edge of the Nubian desert, the caravans began to stir once more. Not with the same vigor, not with the same number of camels or guards, but they moved. Traders whose ledgers had gathered dust returned to the road, carrying grain, salt, and cloth. They spoke of lands where the trees were budding, where the sun had pierced the veil for brief moments at midday. One merchant, a woman named Mereret, kept a journal of her travels. She wrote by moonlight in tiny script, recording each day's sky. Her entry for the 12th of Farmuthi read simply, "Today, the sun touched my face. I remembered warmth." In the mountain cloister of Mount Athos, a group of monks who had spoken only in prayer for more than a year broke their silence. It was Brother Damaris who first spoke, after hearing a nightingale sing in the nearby woods. The sound startled him from his bed. He rushed outside barefoot, and there it was, a bird, real and bright-throated, singing into the cool air. He listened for nearly an hour. When he returned inside, he whispered, "We must sing again." And so they did. It began as a low hum, uncertain. Then came the rise of voices in harmony, some cracked from disuse, others clear and strong. The hymn was old, older than memory, but it carried through the stone halls with a grace that had been forgotten. Outside, the birds sang on. These signs, small, scattered, fragile, were not yet salvation, but they were something more than shadow. The world was not healed. The sun had not fully returned. Hunger still lingered and sickness had not vanished. But here and there, from mountain to sea, from firelit hut to marble temple, the silence was breaking. And beneath the broken sky, people began to lift their heads. In the high plains of Anatolia, where the winds once howled like hungry spirits through the stone-paved passes, the air had turned still. It was not yet warm, no, not even close. But there was a subtle softness to the wind now, like a breath long held finally exhaled. Snow still clung to the shaded side of rocks, but where the sun touched the earth, dark patches of soil began to emerge, uncertain and raw, like old scars rediscovered. In a small hamlet carved into the slope of a rocky hill, the villagers gathered around a single blooming crocus. It had forced its way through frost-hardened ground beside the steps of the chapel. Its purple petals trembled with each movement of air, as if unsure of their own belonging. No one touched it. Even the children, so often careless, stood in quiet awe. An elder named Thalassios whispered, "It remembers the sun." He knelt beside the flower and placed a small pebble at its base, an offering of thanks, or perhaps of reverence. Others followed. Soon a ring of stones encircled the bloom, and the space around it was treated with the sacred silence once reserved for the altar. Meanwhile, in Ravenna, once a city of glittering mosaics and echoing chambers, the Basilica of San Vitale stood solemn, its once crowded nave now occupied only by a few scattered souls. A young man named Faustinus, recently taken into the care of the clergy after losing his family to the winter's fever, spent his days sweeping the marble floors. His broom moved in long, measured strokes, and he whispered prayers beneath his breath, half-remembered lines from a childhood he no longer trusted. But on the third morning of his 7th week, as he pushed open the grand doors to let in the weak daylight, something happened. A beam of sunlight, clear, defined, and gold, cut through the dust and hung suspended in the air like a path laid down by heaven itself. It illuminated the center of the mosaic dome, where the figure of Christ once shimmered in eternal calm. The gold tiles, long dulled, now glinted faintly. Faustinus dropped the broom. He stood beneath the beam, his face turned upward, eyes closed, and for a moment he could feel the heat. It was faint, no more than a whisper on the skin, but it was there. Outside, others began to notice. Not just the return of the light, but its pattern. It came in brief waves now, an hour here, a sliver there. And when it came, people stepped from their homes like moths drawn to a forgotten flame. They did not speak, did not sing. They simply stood, allowing the light to find them. In a remote village north of the Caucasus, the chieftains' council met again for the first time in 3 months. The winter had scattered them, reduced their numbers, silenced their debates. But now with the thaw upon them, they returned to their long hall, wrapped in furs and silence. The fire in the center crackled. Outside, children's laughter, thin and uncertain, floated in. The council did not discuss war, nor trade, nor politics. They spoke only of rebuilding, of reseeding the fields, of searching for those who had vanished in the snow, of preparing for a spring they scarcely believed in. One of the younger men asked if they should send messengers south to see if the Roman borders had shifted. The eldest, a white-bearded man named Vakos, shook his head and said, "Let us find our own borders first." Elsewhere, in the dusty streets of Edessa, a young woman named Miriam stitched a new tunic from worn linen and dyed it with crushed berries that had survived the cold. The color was weak, but she smiled at the faint blush it gave the cloth. She had not made clothes in over a year, not since her family's shop had shuttered with the collapse of the local market. But now a few neighbors had begun to ask for repairs. A hem here, a patch there. She hung her finished work on a rope between 2 cypress trees and waited. A breeze lifted it, slow and graceful. For the first time in many months, she heard footsteps approach from the street. A customer, perhaps even a friend. To the west, near the marshes of Aquitaine, the frogs returned. It happened overnight. One day, the bogs were silent. The next, they sang. A young shepherdess named Isabeau, who had grown used to the stillness of the reeds, sat upright when she heard it. At first, she thought it might be a trick, a sound echoing in from some dream. But as she crept to the edge of the water with her lambs trailing behind, she saw them, fat, wet, and gleaming with life. The frogs leapt from stone to moss, their song sharp and bright against the damp air. Isabeau laughed, and it startled her. She had not laughed aloud in over a year. She knelt in the mud, laughing and weeping all at once, her arms around her smallest lamb. The frogs continued to sing. In the far reaches of the Baltic shores, where pine forests stood dense and hunched with ice, hunters returned to the woods. They did not expect much, but they found tracks, fresh ones. A hare, a deer, even boar. The animals, too, had hidden through the dark, but now they emerged, drawn by the same subtle change in the air. An old hunter named Olive, whose sons had not returned from their last expedition, stood in the middle of a thawed clearing and bowed his head. "They're coming back," he murmured. "Not just the beasts, the old world, piece by piece." Even in Alexandria, where the scholars still met behind shaded windows, debate had shifted. No longer were they asking what had caused the darkness. Now, they debated what would come next. Could a people, so long bent under shadow, return to the light? Would memory serve as anchor or as chain? One philosopher wrote on a scrap of parchment, "In the absence of sun, man found the stars. In the absence of certainty, he found wonder." That parchment was passed hand to hand until it reached a student named Amara, who copied it into the margin of a hymn. And somewhere in the forests of Thrace, beneath a sky still gray but thinning, a group of children built a tower of stones and called it their temple. They laid twigs in a circle, placed a bird's feather in the center, and chanted a song without words. Their feet were bare, their bellies hollow, but their eyes shone. They did not know the history of the darkness. They only knew what they saw. That something somewhere was beginning again. In the hills of Dalmatia, where the mountains leaned down into the sea with slow, ancient patience, the shepherds began to lead their flocks upward once more. For over a year, the goats and sheep had been confined to the lowlands, huddled near the scattered human dwellings where warmth and scraps of grain still remained. But now, the air at the higher slopes no longer burned with frost. Patches of hardy grass pushed through snow melt. The bells around the necks of the animals rang softly as they moved, the first music those paths had heard in many months. One shepherd, a woman named Daria, moved in silence among her flock. Her husband had not returned from the coastal town last winter, and her eldest son had grown thin with hunger. But now, for the first time in many days, He laughed when one of the younger goats leapt and fell clumsily on the wet stones. She looked up. The sun, pale as candle wax but round and defined, glowed behind a veil of thinning clouds. She squinted, then closed her eyes and let the light fall on her cheeks. Not warmth, not yet, but no longer cold. Further inland, in the plains near what was once known as Sirmium, a small group of families gathered to rebuild what had been their village. The place had been all but abandoned during the long winter. Roofs caved in from snow, fields overrun with weeds, fences broken by wind and wild creatures. But the survivors had returned. They did not speak of hope. Hope had become too delicate, too frayed by disappointment. Instead, they worked. They raised walls from fallen timber. They cleared out the rot. A blacksmith named Milan, whose forge had stood unused for months, lit a fire with trembling hands and watched the coals breathe orange again. When the first sparks rose into the air, the children clapped. He gave them pieces of iron scrap and taught them how to shape them with stones. It was not for tools yet, just for learning, for feeling the weight of something that could be made new. In the desert fringes of Arabia, the traders began to stir from their encampments. Many had stayed still for over a year, unwilling to brave the wind-driven ash that had swept down from the north. But now, the stars appeared more clearly at night, and the air no longer carried the sting of unseen dust. A man named Harith, born to a line of spice merchants, gathered what remained of his stock, small bundles of saffron, frankincense, and cinnamon wrapped in oiled cloth. He set out with 3 camels and a boy apprentice who had never seen the world beyond the edge of their oasis. They walked slowly through the desert, following the old routes. Along the way, they found signs of others, footprints, ash-filled fire pits, broken bits of pottery. Life, hesitant, was returning to the roads, and in Rome, faded but still breathing, something stirred among the ruins. The Forum, long emptied of orators and merchants, now held a makeshift gathering. Not a market, not yet, but a place where people came to exchange, not goods, but stories. A woman named Domitilla, old enough to remember the sound of fountains before they froze, sat beneath a crumbling archway with a bowl of roasted chestnuts. She had picked them from trees along the hills, now just beginning to bloom. She gave them freely, asking only for a tale in return. People came. One man told of a bear seen crossing the Tiber with 2 cubs in tow. Another spoke of a shrine outside the city where moss now grew, bright and green, on the statue's feet. A child claimed she had seen bees, 2, maybe 3, nesting in the hollow of a fig tree. No one questioned her. Domitilla listened to each account as though it were scripture. High in the Carpathians, a monk named Sandor walked from monastery to monastery, carrying with him a small wooden box. Inside it lay seeds, barley, lentil, flax, each wrapped in cloth, each labeled with care. He visited the surviving monks, offering them a portion with the request that they plant them with prayer and song. The earth remembers, he said to each one, even when we forget. Some laughed at his optimism. Others accepted the seeds and planted them anyway. A few took them and wept. In a lonely tower in the highlands of Alba, a scribe named Isla wrote by the light of a small oil lamp. Her ink had nearly dried and her hands were stiff from the cold, but she continued to document the days. Her journal had become more than a chronicle. It was a witness. She wrote of the light changing, of the sounds returning, of deer in the valley, of moss on stone, of children speaking louder again. She ended each entry with a line from a prayer, not because she was devout, but because it steadied her hand. And beyond her tower, the winds began to carry scent again, earth, water, pine. Even in Egypt, where the Nile had grown sluggish, the farmers returned to the banks with tools long unused. They did not yet sow in great rows, but dug small holes and tested the soil. One farmer, named Keti, buried a handful of dried dates with a prayer beneath the sand. He did not expect them to sprout, but he needed to know that the gesture still mattered. His wife brought water in a cracked jar. She knelt beside him, watching as he pressed his hand into the earth. When he lifted it, his fingers were black with soil. She kissed them. In the silence that followed, the reeds near the river rustled, not with wind, but with birds. A flash of color, a call across the marshes, then another, and another. Keti looked up and saw them, ibis, cranes, herons, rising from the shallows, their wings wide, catching the pale morning light. He had not seen birds in over a year, and in that moment, with his hands still in the soil, Ketty began to cry, not from sorrow nor even relief, but because something, somewhere, had remembered how to begin again. In the lowlands of Burgundy, where fog often draped the earth like a woolen blanket, the vineyards had stood barren for nearly 2 years. Vines once trained with care had shriveled in the long dusk, and the barrels in the cellars had dried or soured. But now, as the earth softened and the air grew moist with a gentler touch, a few of the vines had begun to show signs of green. Not many, only a handful, but their curling shoots clung to the weathered trellises as though remembering their old purpose. A vintner named Alaric, whose father had died in the bitterest stretch of the last winter, stepped barefoot into the field. He moved slowly, his back bent not only from labor, but from grief. He crouched beside the new growth and traced its edge with a trembling finger. He did not speak, not even to himself. The sun above, muted but present, warmed the back of his neck for the first time in memory. He sat in the dirt until the shadows lengthened. When he rose, he did not clean his hands. In the city of Antioch, where marble columns once gleamed beneath bright skies, the baths had grown still. Their pools, once filled with laughter and steam, now lay silent, coated in grime and mold. But the aqueducts had begun to run again. Engineers, working with what strength they could muster, cleared the blockages, redirected the water, coaxed it back to life. At first, it was only a trickle, but soon the baths gurgled once more with ancient rhythm. Women came to wash linens, children to play, old men to sit on the steps and remember what it meant to be clean. A blind man stood beneath one of the stone fountains and tilted his head back as the cold stream struck his face. He smiled, then laughed, a bright cracked sound that echoed through the courtyard like birdsong. In Iberia, far to the west, where the hills roll like waves into the interior, a band of traveling musicians emerged from a monastery where they had been given shelter through the long night. Their instruments had warped from damp and disused, their strings stretched or broken. But one among them, a woman named Eulalia, managed to retune her lyre with slow, loving hands. At twilight, beneath a sky streaked faintly with pink, she played. The tune was simple, a lullaby passed down through forgotten generations. Villagers gathered in silence, some weeping without knowing why. Her fingers moved with the grace of memory, even though her body was thin, her cheeks hollow. When she stopped, the silence that followed was not empty. It was full. Along the banks of the Seine, the water once low and clouded with ash now ran clearer. Children dipped their toes in, shrieking with delight. Their parents watched from the banks, cautious but grateful. A small boy named Luke took a piece of driftwood and carved it into the shape of a horse. He tied a string around its neck and dragged it behind him through the muddy paths, imagining it galloping beside him. He told no one, but he named it Lumiere, for light. In the Bavarian woods, where mist clung like a second skin to trees and stone, a midwife named Greta helped deliver the first healthy baby the village had seen in over a year. The mother, pale but strong, cried silently as she cradled the boy against her chest. Outside the hut, villagers waited in hushed reverence. When Greta emerged and gave the news, they cheered, not loud but real. A candle was lit and placed on the doorstep. Others followed. By midnight, the whole path glowed. That night, Greta sat with the newborn cradled in her arms, watching the stars. She counted them aloud as if proving to herself that they were still there. 1, 2, 3, 9 stars. She could see 9 stars. In the marshes near Thessaloniki, frogs continued their return. So too did the reeds sway with wind that no longer smelled of death. Fishermen, long fearful of casting nets in water that brought no reward, began once again to set their traps. One morning, a man named Petros pulled from the shallows a basket of eels, thick, writhing, alive. He carried them back to the village, and for the first time in many months, a fire was lit in the communal hearth. The eels were roasted and shared among those who remained. Old recipes, long unsung, were recalled from memory. A woman named Calypso crushed garlic and herbs between stones, humming under her breath. Her neighbors joined her. Someone began to sing. It was a fragment of a sea song, one once sung by sailors before voyages. The words had faded with time, but the melody was clear. They sang it slowly, not as celebration, but as ritual, as remembrance. And in Jerusalem, where the silence of stone had pressed against the hearts of its people, The first saffron crocus bloomed in a crack between two flagstones in the courtyard of the old temple. A boy named Eleazar, sweeping dust as part of his morning chores, saw it first. He dropped his broom and crouched beside it, his breath catching. He did not call for anyone. He simply sat, as though afraid to move, afraid to frighten it back into the earth. When the sun crested the roof of the temple and touched the crocus with gold, he reached out one hand, not to pluck it, but to shade it. Later that day, the elders found him still there. He looked up and said only, "It's beautiful." To the east, beyond the Tigris, in a town half swallowed by sand, a forgotten shrine flickered with light. No one had entered it in years. But one evening, a traveler, wounded, weary, carrying a satchel of dried figs, stepped inside and lit a lamp. He said no prayers, offered no incense. He simply sat in the warmth, removed his boots, and placed one hand on the worn stone of the altar. Outside, the wind shifted. The dunes stilled. Across the known world, the turning was subtle, not yet secure. But it had begun. The people did not shout it from rooftops. They did not declare that the darkness was gone. But their hearts, battered though they were, began to loosen their grip on fear. They allowed themselves to feel wonder again, not in grand gestures, but in the quiet places. A goat born in the frost, a child's laughter on the wind, a flower growing in stone. The sky, though still clouded, no longer pressed down like a shroud, and where there had once been only waiting, there was now watching, watching for what might come next, watching for light. In the quiet corners of Gaul, where old Roman roads had broken under the weight of years and neglect, the moss had begun to withdraw. Travelers, once absent, now appeared in pairs or small groups, pilgrims, tinkers, scribes, each moving with quiet purpose, as if the earth itself had granted permission to journey once more. The roads remained cracked, littered with branches and the forgotten tools of abandonment, but footsteps returned nonetheless. In a village called Belun, cradled in the hills not far from the Loire, an old teacher named Emmerich opened the doors of his crumbling schoolhouse. The roof had partially collapsed in the long winter, but enough of it remained to shelter a dozen children. He swept the stone floor with a pine branch, then rang a small bell from his windowsill. He did not expect anyone, but they came. Not all at once, not loudly, but steadily. Children in patched cloaks, faces thin but eyes alive, stepped through the doorway one by one. They brought no books, only bundles of sticks for the hearth and scraps of bread wrapped in cloth. They sat on stone benches and listened as Emmerich recited the first words of a lesson on the stars. He spoke not of gods or fear, but of how stars moved in circles, slow and beautiful, through even the darkest sky. In the city of Constantinople, where plague had scoured whole neighborhoods, the survivors stepped into the streets like mourners after a funeral. They moved slowly, as if not yet convinced the danger had passed. But the fires that once burned to purify the air had been extinguished. The wailing had lessened. The birds, absent for so long, now landed on windowsills and eaves, calling out in song. The Emperor Justinian, aged beyond his years but still seated on the throne, issued no new laws. He merely stood upon the balcony of the great palace one morning and lifted his hand toward the sea. Those who saw him said his face bore no triumph, only solemn gratitude. In a quiet house near the Theodosian walls, a young girl named Irina lit a lamp each evening and placed it in her window. Her father had never returned from the healer's tents. Her brother worked at the docks. But she had kept the habit, begun during the worst days: light the lamp, say nothing, and wait. One night, as the breeze shifted and the city no longer smelled of illness, she saw a second lamp glowing in a window across the alley. Then a third. By the end of the week, her whole street gleamed with scattered stars. To the south, in the olive groves of Cyprus, trees that had once curled their branches inward as if in mourning now began to stir with pale blossoms. The olives would not ripen for months, but the scent of flowers returned, bitter, clean, ancient. Farmers who had taken to burning the dead wood now paused, touched the new growth, and stepped away in silence. A boy named Lycos, whose mother had buried two brothers beneath the grove, sang a tune as he walked between the trees. It was a song she had taught him when the world still made sense. His voice, high and uncertain, followed the wind like a thread, and in the marketplace of Jerusalem, the stalls began to reopen. They were not full, not yet, But figs appeared in baskets, herbs bound in twine. Cloth dyed faint shades of saffron and indigo. The buyers came carefully. They touched, weighed, considered. A merchant named Rafi, who had spoken to no one since the sickness claimed his wife, offered a smile to a customer, a soft, fleeting curve of the lips, but real. His neighbor, a potter named Ananias, placed a blue pitcher on his table and said, "She would have liked this one." Rafi nodded and said nothing. In a northern monastery, Brother Ethelred walked the garden path alone. The monks had long ceased tending the vegetables, for nothing had grown. But now, weeds, brave, stubborn green, rose along the edges. He bent down and ran his fingers along one. It pricked his skin. He welcomed it. He returned to the scriptorium that evening and opened a blank vellum. With careful strokes he wrote, "The earth draws breath again." Then he paused, and beneath it he added, "And so shall we." On the edge of the Rhine, in a cottage surrounded by brittle hedges, a weaver named Hiltrude set her loom upright. The wool she had stored during the famine had nearly rotted, but enough remained. She worked in rhythm, hands moving with practiced grace, weaving patterns she had learned from her mother's mother. As she worked, her neighbor, a widow named Ragna, brought her flax. "We'll need thread for planning bags," she said. Hiltrude smiled and replied, "And blankets for the children who'll be born this year." They said nothing more, but wove together in companionable silence. And in the eastern lands past the Caspian shores, the caravans grew longer. Word spread that the markets of the west were returning. In Samarkand and Nishapur, colors reappeared. Dyes once locked away in fear of waste, silks folded in cedar chests. Poets gathered again in the corners of tea houses, whispering verses that remembered heat and light. One wrote, "We are not what we were, but neither are we ashes." His words were copied on slip paper and passed along trade routes. Some wrapped spices in them. Others used them as bookmarks. A few were tucked beneath pillows. And deep within the forest of our dens, under trees just beginning to bud, a mother fox led her kits from their den. They blinked in the dappled light, stumbled, then followed. A hunter, crouched on a ridge, lowered his bow. He watched them vanish into the underbrush, then turned homeward, empty-handed and at peace. These were not victories. There were no feasts, no trumpets, but they were signs. The world, cautious and scarred, was leaning toward life again. It did not rush, it did not declare itself, but it stirred quietly, like a sleeper rousing after a long, strange dream. And the people, those who remained, stirred with it. In the rolling meadows near the Rhone, where flowers had long forgotten the warmth of bloom, the fields now shimmered faintly with wild chamomile and young lavender. They were not yet thick, not yet confident, but they reached upward with silent urgency, lifting their delicate heads toward the pale sun that once again traced a path across the sky, slender, slow, but certain. A beekeeper named Marin stepped out of his cottage at first light. He had not checked the hives in over a year. Most had collapsed, emptied by starvation or taken by cold. But as he approached the far edge of his orchard, he heard a hum. Not loud, not yet, but unmistakable. He rounded the corner, and there they were, bees. Only a handful, darting from blossom to blossom on the nearest apple tree. But they flew. He knelt in the grass and placed his hand on the earth, feeling its heartbeat, slow and deep. His breath caught. He stayed there until the sun climbed beyond the hills, his shadow long behind him. In the mountains of Armenia, the shrine of stones that Arshak had once built now rose higher, layer by layer, stone by stone. Travelers added their own as they passed, each with a word spoken, a name whispered, or nothing at all, just the quiet act of placing something steady upon something sacred. This spring, for the first time, a wild rosebush grew at its base. It curled around the stones, its thorns gentle, its buds pale pink. Arshak, now older and thinner, brushed the petals with his knuckles and sat beside them, hands folded in his lap. He no longer tended the flame every day. It burned on its own now, fueled by others, visitors, villagers, even children. What had once been his vigil was now shared. To the north, in the wide plains beyond Kiev, the herds returned. It began with a line of hoofprints in the softening earth. Then came the shaggy shapes of aurochs and deer, moving through the grass in cautious silence. The hunters watched from afar, not with greed, but reverence. One young man, Misha, took off his boots and walked barefoot across the thawed plain, feeling each blade of grass beneath his feet as if it were the first he'd ever touched. He did not carry a bow. He brought salt and left it near the tracks as offering. In the city of Alexandria, scholars gathered beneath the dome of the old library. For many months they had debated the causes of the darkness, volcanoes, divine displeasure, celestial events, but now their attention had shifted. They studied how plants returned, how waters cleared, how the winds changed. They began writing not of endings, but of beginnings. One scholar, a young woman named Cassia, charted the return of birds. She climbed the tower every morning and recorded which ones she saw. On the day she spotted the ibis, once thought vanished, she wept, her ink blotting the page. That evening she walked the colonnade barefoot, her hair unbound, singing a hymn to the stars. In the far north of Britannia, beneath skies that still hung heavy with cloud, the tribes emerged from their hill forts. They spoke little of the long year. Instead, they met in clearings, circled fires, and shared broth made from roots and game. The bards returned, voices rough but sure, and recited the old stories, adding to them new verses of endurance, of hunger survived, of ancestors honored through silence. A young bard named Fenon sang of the sun as a mother who had gone to sleep beneath the sea, leaving the world in the care of her children. She dreamt of us, he sang, and we dreamt her back. They passed the words from mouth to mouth, across valleys and glens. In the distant city of Petra, the desert winds no longer carried ash. The red stone walls, long silent, echoed once more with footfall. Merchants returned, not many, but enough to reopen the shaded stalls carved into the cliffs. A woman named Nura set down a row of clay vessels painted with stars and palms. Her father had made them before the sky darkened. She had kept them hidden, wrapped in linen. Now they stood in sunlight. She did not price them. She offered them in exchange for songs. Travelers brought music from Persia, from Judea, from the Nile, and each song was recorded on a clay tablet, etched with stylus, pressed with memory. The vessels slowly vanished. The tablets remained. Along the banks of the Danube, a young couple built a house from the wreckage of 3 others. Their names were Danis and Ilka. They had met during the worst winter, sharing bread from a monastery storeroom. Now they gathered splintered beams, smoothed bent nails, and rebuilt one wall at a time. When it was done, it was crooked and small, but it stood. They planted sunflowers beside the door. Ilka placed a bowl of salt in the window. Danis carved their names into the lintel. In the high cliffs of the Alps, spring came slowest. The ice lingered. The wind still carried the hiss of past storms. But in one mountain pass, beneath a jagged shelf of stone, a snowdrop bloomed. A traveler, an old soldier named Bernhard, saw it as he rounded the bend. He knelt, not to pluck it, but to bow his head. He stayed the night near it, wrapped in a wool cloak, letting the memory of battles fall away. He whispered, "You made it." And then, "So did I." In Jerusalem, as the days lengthened, the temple singers raised their voices for the first time in many months. The hymn they chose was not one of triumph, but of return. It spoke of light remembered, of silence endured, of breath held and released. The wind carried the song through narrow alleys, past shuttered windows, and out to the hills. And in a small cave on the eastern slope, a hermit named Simeon opened his eyes. He had not spoken since the darkness began, nor lit a fire. But now, hearing the distant notes, he reached for a reed pipe hidden beneath a stone and played a single note in reply. High, clear, soft. The world, having once hidden its face in shadow, was now listening. In the wetlands of the Po Valley, the waters moved more freely than they had in many months. The marshes, once stagnant and thick with the remains of a halted world, now shimmered in the morning light with a film of green and silver. Dragonflies returned, hovering like living jewels over the shallows, and frogs sang through the reeds, no longer in solitude. An old fisherman named Giacomo pushed his boat from the muddy bank just after sunrise. His hands, calloused and worn, remembered the rhythm of oars, though they moved slower now. He was alone. His sons had fled to the mountains during the worst of the sickness, but he rowed not in grief, but in stillness. The sun, muted and low, spread a soft gold across the rippling surface. When he cast his net, he did not expect abundance. He only wished to begin again. That day he caught 2 fish, enough for supper, enough for prayer. In a mountain hamlet near Lake Ohrid, where the stones were steeped in centuries of silence, the bells of the small chapel rang once more. No feast was called, no wedding nor festival, It was simply time. Father Petar, nearly blind, stood in the bell tower, feeling the rope in his hands as though it were a thread back to the living. He pulled gently. The sound that followed was not loud. It did not echo far, but it was clean and it was heard. Children followed the sound through the crooked lanes, barefoot, chasing its music through damp courtyards. They found the chapel door open for the first time in over a year. Father Petar did not speak. He only sat on the stone bench outside and nodded. They sat with him until dusk. To the east, in the once bustling cities of Mesopotamia, life seeped into streets left desolate by both plague and dust. In Ctesiphon, a merchant named Tamar opened his shutters for the first time since his brother's passing. He had kept them closed through sickness, mourning, and cold. Now, as sunlight spilled across the mosaic floor, he moved slowly through the house, removing cloths from shelves, dusting bowls, brushing cobwebs from his father's copper scales. That evening, he placed 3 pomegranates on a tray and set it outside his door. Neighbors walked past, their heads bowed. Then one stopped, a woman with a cracked walking stick. She looked at the fruit, then at Tamar, and gave a nod so slight it could have been the wind. She took one and left behind a fig. In the forests beyond Prague, sap bled from trees again, not from injury but from life. The trunks, darkened by months of wet, now held patches of green lichen. Mushrooms sprung near the roots. Birds returned in clusters, noisy and fearless. A woodcutter named Pavel returned to his grove and found his axe where he had left it, buried head down beside a fallen beech. He did not lift it. Instead, he sat beside it and listened. A pair of finches darted above him, landing on a branch that swayed gently in the warming breeze. The air smelled of bark, wet soil, and smoke from distant chimneys. Pavel did not weep. He closed his eyes and smiled without showing his teeth, content in the presence of the ordinary. In Athens, where marble had cracked and market stalls had crumbled, students gathered in the shade of a ruined column to listen to a philosopher named Megistos. He had once taught within the portico of a library that now stood in silence. Now he sat on a broken plinth, his hair white, his tunic plain, speaking not of logic or rhetoric, but of endurance. He said, "The vine does not ask the sun to hurry, it simply waits and grows." His students, few in number, young and hungry, nodded. One took notes with a stylus made from bone. Another plucked at a lyre with only 3 strings. And down by the harbor, a group of stonemasons began repairing a wall, not because it was ordered, not for coin, but because they had the strength to do so again. In a small monastery on the edge of the Moesian border, a girl named Sabina returned to the chapel garden. She had once tended it with her grandmother, planting rows of mint and fennel between stones arranged in a spiral. The long frost had stolen nearly everything, but she had kept a seed in a cloth pouch tied with string, worn against her chest. Now she knelt and pressed it into the soil. She did not know if it would grow, but her hands knew what to do. She whispered the old prayer her grandmother had said with every planting, words soft as breath. Let what is buried rise again. Far away in the deserts near the Levantine coast, rain fell. Not in torrents, not enough to flood, just enough to darken the sand, to trace lines down stone, to make the air smell suddenly sweet and ancient. Shepherds tilted their faces upward. Camels snorted and turned toward the breeze. In a cave sheltering 3 travelers, a fire was lit not out of necessity, but in gratitude. One of them, a youth named Edil, took a burnt stick and drew a circle on the rock wall, a symbol of sun encircled by rays. He did not explain it, but the others touched it in passing, as if it were already sacred. And in a field outside the ruins of Carthage, a tree bloomed. It was an almond, old and twisted, its roots grown into the rubble of a bathhouse long collapsed. No one had touched it, no one had watered it. Yet its branches bore white blossoms tinged with blush, trembling in the sea breeze. A woman walking by stopped, drawn by the color. She placed her palm on the bark and closed her eyes. The world, scarred and subdued, had not forgotten how to respond. And somewhere in the distance, across mountains and rivers, valleys and deserts, the first thunderclouds of spring formed. Not with violence, not yet, but with promise. A sky no longer sealed, a world no longer numb. Something deep had shifted, not loudly, not quickly, but like all things that return from silence, it was moving. In the green folds of the Pannonian plain, the land had begun to exhale. The breath of the soil, once stale and heavy, and now carried the scent of wet grass and crushed blossoms. It wasn't yet warm, but the cold had lost its edge. Streams that had frozen mid-laugh now murmured again, winding through fields speckled with blue gentians and yellow primroses. At the edge of a clearing, an old musician named Istvan sat on a stump beside a broken fence, his dulcimer laid across his knees. The strings had rusted, the wood warped from damp, but he tuned it gently, humming as he worked. He did not aim to perform. He only wished to see if music remembered its way. When the first note rang out, faint, wavering, but true, he closed his eyes. A group of children from the village nearby heard the sound and followed it like a trail through the grass. They found Istvan playing slowly, nodding to himself with each phrase. The children sat around him in silence, knees drawn to chests, eyes wide. He did not pause to greet them. The melody was old, older than memory, and it was theirs as much as his. Elsewhere, in a cloister tucked among the hills of Tuscany, the Sisters of the Order of St. Lysandra opened the refectory windows for the first time in over a year. The shutters creaked. The hinges groaned. But the scent of thyme from the garden below drifted up, and Sister Regina wept. She stood by the windowsill, holding a bundle of rosemary cut that morning. The others sat at the long wooden table, hands folded, waiting. She placed the herbs in a bowl at the center, then lit a candle and gave thanks, not for abundance, but for survival. They ate in silence, but with eyes lifted. In the low forests of Dusha, mushrooms burst from the mossy ground in clusters, more than the villagers could recall seeing before. People foraged together again, mothers with baskets, grandfathers with walking sticks. Laughter, brittle but honest, echoed through the trees. One girl, only 6, found a ring of pale blue caps growing in a perfect circle. She called the others, but they only watched, unsure. The old tales warned of such rings, but the girl stepped into the center, arms raised, and danced. Nothing cursed her. The wind stirred the grass. Her mother joined her, and then another. Soon they danced in circles as if waking the land. In the deserts of the Eastern Caliphate, the caravan bells returned. Long muted by dust and fear, they rang once again as camels moved over dunes smoother than memory. Traders brought word of healing in the west. Green valleys in Gaul, blossoming olive trees in Hispania, the soft return of markets in Rome. They brought cloth from India, pearls from Oman, but the true treasure was news. In the oasis town of Alhambra, an old blind storyteller named Malik heard these tales and turned them into verses. He sat beneath the palms, his voice as dry as reed paper but steady. His listeners leaned in close, not for drama but for direction. In his telling, the darkness became a test, and the light a quiet gift earned through patience. His final line always came the same. The world was not lost, it only slept. In the moors of Wales, the soil grew softer beneath the hooves of sheep. The shepherds, gaunt and wary, led their flocks further each week. One day, a ewe gave birth beside a fallen oak. The lamb was strong, breathing quickly, bleeding with vigor. Its fleece was soft and white. The shepherd Murig knelt beside it, brushing away clumps of earth. He made no offering. He only leaned down and whispered, "Welcome," as though the lamb had arrived from another world. And in the icy reaches of the north, the aurora returned. Not the full splendor, not yet, but streaks of pale green and violet flickered once more across the sky. The Sami people watched from their reindeer camps in awe and in silence. Elders, wrapped in furs stitched with care, traced the lights with gnarled fingers. They told the children that the spirits had forgiven the earth. To the west, in the crumbled lanes of Lutetia, now barely a city, artists began to draw again. With charcoal and berry dye, they traced animals on walls, flowers on stone. One woman painted a child's hand, pressing it to a crumbled archway where ivy had begun to climb again. She painted in silence, her baby tied to her back, humming with every stroke. Others followed. Soon, the ruins bore color once more, not banners or crests, but marks of life, vines, birds, flames, hands. And beneath those painted walls, people gathered. They shared bread, still hard, still rationed, but they broke it with reverence. A mason named Edouard played a small flute carved from bone. A widow recited psalms. A girl told a joke and made an old man smile so widely he forgot his aching knees. In that moment, they were no longer survivors. They were neighbors again. In the village of Sarnaxos, where the story had once begun, The last of the snows melted from the ridgelines. Leontius, now bent further with age, sat on the same stone where he had once whispered prayers for the sun. He no longer whispered, he simply watched. A green shoot had grown near the edge of his garden, unplanted, uninvited but alive. He nodded at it, not as to a plant but to a guest. And beside him, a child, his granddaughter, returned at last, picked up a stone and placed it gently around the shoot's base. "It's starting again," she said. Leontius smiled, not with his mouth, but with his eyes. "Yes," he said, "it is." Along the banks of the Euphrates, where the water had once receded like breath drawn too tightly, the river flowed fuller now, though not yet as it once had. It moved with quiet strength, bearing flecks of silt and green along its current. On its edge stood a boy named Kadir, casting pebbles into the water one by one, as if testing its patience. His grandfather sat nearby beneath a fig tree, legs folded, chewing dates slowly. "Do you think the river forgives us?" the boy asked, watching the ripples stretch and fade. The old man chuckled, his voice worn thin by time. "No, child, the river does not remember what we forget. It only waits." From behind them, the scent of bread drifted on the morning air. It was coarse bread, made from grains scraped together over many months, but it was bread still. And now, more often than not, the loaves rose. In the hills of Cappadocia, the wind had changed. It no longer carried dust thick as cloth, nor did it scrape the skin with every gust. Instead, it passed gently through the stone chimneys and valleys, rustling the climbing vines that had begun to peek from the cracks in the rock. In one hollow carved into the soft stone, a woman named Eleni lit a fire in a clay oven she had not touched since the dark sky came. Her family, once a community of 15, now numbered only 3. Still, she sang as she baked, not loudly, but with the rhythm of the kneading. When the bread was done, she cut a piece for each of them and wrapped the rest in cloth. Then, walking up the ridge, she left it at the door of a cave that had been empty for months. She knocked once, just in case. No one answered. But the next day, the bread was gone, and a handful of wild herbs had been left in its place. In the lands west of the Elbe, where tangled forests once grew impenetrable, the trees now stood with more light between them. Storms had felled many, and disease more, but what remained reached upward with renewed clarity. A smith named Wolfram rebuilt his forge there, piece by piece, using the stones from an abandoned watchtower nearby. He did not yet have the fuel for great fires, but he built a hearth and set a blade in the coals for tempering. Children watched him from the trees, curious and cautious. When he caught sight of them, he lifted the blade high and let the weak sunlight catch its surface. "It's not sharp yet," he said, "but it will be." In the ports of Tyre and Sidon, sails returned. Ships small and narrow, their hulls patched, their captains lean and weathered. They came from Alexandria, from Rhodes, from the creaking docks of the Adriatic. They carried little, spices, thread, dried lemons, but they carried stories. At the harbor's edge, a woman named Samira strung a net between 2 poles and laid her fish out to dry. Her catch was small, but more than she had seen in a year. She sang a sailor's tune, one she had learned from her brother before the sea took him. A boy joined her, clapping the rhythm. His laughter was cracked but clear. And that night, along the narrow alleys of the port city, lanterns hung from doorways for the first time in seasons. Not for festivity, for direction, for anyone still coming. In the valleys near Cordoba, orange trees bore fruit again. The harvest was meager and the fruit small, but it was fragrant. The groves, once overgrown and choked by weeds, had been cleared by hands calloused from labor. A father and daughter worked side by side, baskets slung over shoulders. As they picked, they recited proverbs between them, ones the father remembered from his mother, passed down in nights when war or weather drove them inside. At one point, the girl stopped and held an orange to her nose, inhaling deeply. "This smells like sunlight," she said. "No," the father replied, his voice thick. "It smells like remembering." In the high steppes of Asia, where the cold had pressed hardest, herders returned to their patterns. The yurt frames, long disassembled and buried for protection, were raised again. Fires were lit with dried dung and flickering hope. Herds moved slowly over the hills, thinner than before, but breathing. A grandmother named Erki sat by her tent's entrance, holding a spindle between her fingers. Her granddaughter, wrapped in thick furs, leaned against her leg and watched the clouds drift low across the horizon. Do you think the sky is finished being angry? The girl asked. Urquiz smiled and spun the wool. No, child, but it has remembered how to listen. In a monastery perched on the cliffs of Galicia, the bells tolled for the spring feast, not with joy, but with devotion. Pilgrims began to arrive once again, their feet blistered, their clothes threadbare, but their eyes bright. Among them walked a man named Mateo, who had carried a single candle from the mountains. He had not lit it yet. He was saving it for the chapel. When he reached the altar, he placed it upon the stone and struck a spark with trembling hands. The wick caught, the flame held. Others watched in silence as it flickered, steady and gold. One of the brothers whispered, "It will be a season of small fires," and they believed him. Across the world, in every corner where life had once curled inward to wait, it now stirred. Not as before, not as it had in abundance and pride, but slowly, carefully, with the knowledge of loss. The earth was not healed, but it was healing. The air was not warm, but it was no longer cruel. The people, once bowed beneath shadow, now walked with eyes lifted, not in triumph, but in reverence. And though they did not say it aloud, they all carried the same word within them, like an ember waiting for breath. Again, in the meadows near the Danube, the grass grew thick and lush, bending under the weight of morning dew. For the first time in years, the cattle returned to graze without fear of sudden frost or poisoned ground. Their breath steamed in the cool spring air, but their eyes were calm, their movements easy. Farmers stood by the fence lines in silence, watching the herds spread out like ink upon parchment. Among them was a man named Oscar, who had once given up on the land. After the second failed harvest, he had buried his tools and left the field to wild weeds. But this spring, he returned. He found the soil dark again, no longer sick. When he pressed his hands into the earth, it gave beneath his fingers, not in surrender, but in welcome. He planted barley in rows, carefully, one seed at a time. To the west, in the winding lanes of Marseille, the scent of salt returned to the air. For many months, the wind had smelled only of sickness and closed doors. Now the sea brought perfume again, of fish, of kelp, of the far-off world. Boats, once moored in silence, creaked against their ropes as their owners tested sails, patched nets, caressed the wooden ribs like old friends. A woman named Aurore, whose family had once sold fish from a small stall near the harbor, now stood there again. Her baskets were not full, but there was enough to share. She called out softly to those who passed. A few returned. One brought a copper coin, another a loaf of bread. A child pointed at the silver glint of a mackerel and asked, "What is it?" She bent down, placed the fish in the boy's hands, and said, "Something we forgot we loved." In the highlands of Armenia, the air turned fragrant with snowmelt and mountain sage. The flocks climbed higher, bells ringing, echoing across the valleys. Shepherds moved with slow confidence, their dogs padding ahead, alert but calm. The mountains, once looming like frozen giants, now seemed less watchful, more forgiving. Arshak's shrine, once a small circle of stones and flame, had grown. Pilgrims left more than offerings now. They left stories, pieces of their own journey carved into wood, tied in cloth, scratched into stone. One evening, a woman left a cradle made of twigs, woven with dry grasses. Inside it, a tiny doll wrapped in lavender. A message, a prayer, a promise. In the far north, where the land blurred into the edge of the world, the ice had receded. Glaciers still stood like silent witnesses, but the rivers beneath them moved freely again. Salmon swam upstream, their bodies slick and strong. Inlet villages saw the return of seals to the shallows, their dark eyes peering curiously at the humans who watched them from rocky shores. On a small island near the Scandinavian coast, a boy named Eirik lit a fire with his father. They roasted shellfish together, an evening meal not eaten in over 2 years. The boy had no memory of the taste, only stories told through the dark. When he bit into the first warm piece, he gasped, not at the flavor, but at its familiarity. His father smiled. That is how we remember we are still ourselves. In Jerusalem, the temple choirs sang once more with the full harmony of voices. Their hymn, a piece held in silence for a year and a day, rose through the colonnades like mist turning to light. Those who had once listened from the shadows now stepped into the aisles, heads bowed, hearts lifted. Ezra, now a young man with shoulders beginning to broaden, stood near the back, holding a torch that no longer felt symbolic. It was necessary. The sun had returned, but the building still held the chill of long grief. As the choir rose into the higher chords, he lit each corner with careful reverence. His flame met the gold of mosaics once dulled by dust. They shimmered, shy but steady. Elsewhere, across the plains of Gaul, villagers began to walk the roads between settlements again. They carried carts with seeds, cloth, tools. But more than these, they carried songs. Walking songs, work songs, lullabies that had been buried in silence. One such song, first sung by a woman crossing from one village to the next, carried across the hills, picked up by another voice, then another. It traveled not by parchment or proclamation, but by humming lips, echoing steps. It was a simple melody with words that changed depending on who sang it. But always the refrain came the same. We are not alone. We walk, we walk. In the port of Syracuse, lanterns were lowered into the sea, not to mourn, but to bless. Each one bore a small note inside, names, wishes, fragments of psalms or poetry. They floated gently into the harbor, their flames flickering against the ripples. Some sank, others drifted out of sight. A child watching from the docks whispered, "The sea remembers too." And in a lonely village in the Carpathians, an ancient woman named Zorica planted her last handful of beans. She had saved them for years, hidden in a cloth pouch beneath her bed, waiting for a spring that felt worthy. She bent slowly, pressing each one into the earth with a whispered name. Some were names of those lost, others were of those not yet born. When she finished, she sat on a wooden stool, holding a cup of warmed milk. The sun touched the top of the trees. Birds called from branches. A squirrel darted past her feet, pausing just long enough to look. Zorica lifted her cup. "To the stubbornness of life," she said, and drank. Across the world, in places broken and quiet, light continued to return. Not with certainty, not with spectacle, but with gentleness. The kind that required watching, the kind that needed tending, the kind that was easily missed but impossible to forget once seen. People began to believe not in the end of darkness, but in the strength of their own waiting. And the world, humbled and worn, offered its answer, not in words, in roots, in song, in silence, shared between strangers. In the soft, unwavering vow of life beginning again, in the narrow alleys of Antioch, once choked by silence and sickness, laughter returned, first timid, then growing like ivy on old walls. The city's wounds were still visible, shuttered homes, empty niches in temples, ash stains on marble. But between the broken stones, life crept back, not in defiance, but in resilience, like a child's hand reaching for sunlight. A baker named Theodora reopened her oven one morning after months of dust and stillness. She had no yeast, but she mixed wild herbs with flour and water, forming flat rounds and baking them on hot stones. The scent drifted down the alleyways and drew people in, not for hunger alone, but for memory. The warmth of it touched something deep in them, as though the bread carried echoes of gentler days. An old man lingered outside her shop, staring. She stepped out and pressed a loaf into his hands without speaking. He held it to his face, inhaled, and wept. She did not comfort him. She simply returned to the oven and kept baking. Far to the north, beyond the forests and rivers, the sun broke through a canopy of gray for a full day. It was a rare, clear sky, blue like ink spilled on linen. The people of a small hamlet near Novgorod gathered outside without coats for the first time in over a year. They turned their faces to the warmth, silent, letting it touch their skin like a blessing. A young girl, still barefoot from winter's frugality, spun in place until she collapsed in the grass, laughing. Her mother, watching from a doorway, smiled and said, "She dances like she doesn't remember the cold." To the east, on the vast plains where horsemen once thundered with banners flying, the grass returned in waves. Herds scattered by famine, now reformed, their foals born into a world just beginning to recover. A chieftain named Batu, who had buried more friends than he could name, rode quietly through the morning mist, scanning the horizon not for danger, but for growth. When he reached a shallow stream, he dismounted, removed his gloves, and dipped his hands into the water. It was cold and clear. He drank, then stood and whispered a phrase to no one. "Let this be the last year of forgetting." In the high passes of the Pyrenees, snow melted slowly, revealing moss-covered stones and the first crocus blooms. A group of travelers, once trapped by weather and fear, made their descent into the valleys. They did not speak much, but they moved together, passing water between them, helping the weakest across slippery paths. Among them was a woman named Visoria, who carried a pouch filled with seeds, lavender, thyme, poppy, lentil. She had gathered them throughout her exile, unsure why she kept them. Now she felt the time had come. When they reached the first village, she knelt beside an abandoned well and scattered a few into the cracks. "They will find the way," she said softly, "just as we did." In the markets of Baghdad, trade resumed, not in grandeur, not in opulence, but with dignity. Silk merchants unfurled narrow bolts, paper makers dipped frames into pulp, and spice sellers reopened their jars with careful hands. The air was filled with unfamiliar quiet, not the hush of absence, but the gentle murmur of recovery. A calligrapher named Zahir set up his stall again near the old fountain. He had no commissions yet, but he painted anyway. Phrases in curling script, verses about patience, about time, about breath. He hung them from a line between two poles, fluttering like prayer flags in the wind. A child approached and asked, "What do they say?" Zahir smiled. "They say the world still speaks if you listen gently." To the south, on the sands of Numidia, nomads moved from oasis to oasis, their camels sleek with the return of grazing. A young rider named Malik led a caravan across the salt plains, guiding his companions by stars that now gleamed more clearly overhead. The night sky, once veiled by ash and cloud, had reopened. When they reached the edge of a palm grove, they found the well not dry, but shallow and cool. Malik dropped a bucket, waited, then tasted. He passed it around without a word. When the last had drunk, he marked the ground with a circle, the symbol for peace. And in the far west, where Celtic stones still stood in silent rings, moss gave way to grass, and the stones cast shadows again. In a field outside a coastal village, a group of women lit fires in a spiral, each flame a memory of someone lost. They did not cry, they did not sing. They stood in silence, hands joined, their faces reflecting gold. One of them, older than the rest, whispered a blessing in a forgotten tongue. Her granddaughter repeated it in the new speech of the village, and so it passed, old words carried forward on young lips. That night, a shooting star crossed the sky above them, and someone gasped. The others looked up, and for a moment all breath stopped. It was not an omen, it was not a miracle, it was only light, and that now was enough. Across forests and deserts, coasts and mountains, the world no longer held its breath. It breathed again, not evenly, not fully, but truly, and the people who had endured the silence did not seek to fill it with noise. They moved with care, with reverence. They had become keepers of a fragile trust, the understanding that joy, like sunlight, must be welcomed gently and never taken for granted. In the vineyards of Liguria, where terraced hills overlooked the shimmering blue of the Mediterranean, green returned not in haste, but with ceremony. The vines, long believed dead, had begun to bud. Leaves unfolded like shy hands, and the scent of the earth beneath them grew sweet with new warmth. The farmers who had not abandoned their land moved slowly among the rows, their fingers brushing the growth as if greeting an old friend. Among them was a woman named Benedetta, who had once sung to the vines in her childhood. Now grown, her voice was softer, weathered by grief and long winters, but the song remained. She sang it again, low and steady, while she pruned the young shoots. Others heard her and did not interrupt. Some hummed along, their bodies swaying with the rhythm of the work. When the song ended, the hillside felt fuller, as though it had inhaled. In a small chapel carved into a cave near Smyrna, candles burned without oil. Instead, they were dipped in beeswax once again, gathered from new hives found in the cliffs above. The monks moved quietly through the corridors, their sandals whispering against the stone. One of them, Brother Irenaeus, spent his evenings transcribing psalms not in Latin or Greek, but in silence. He wrote without ink, tracing letters into soft sand spread on a tray beside his mat. Each night the wind scattered his work. Each morning he began again. His fellow brothers once questioned this strange ritual, but they came to understand it, not as labor lost, but reverence expressed. The act, not the record, was the prayer. In the markets of Thessaloniki, a potter's wheel spun once more. The potter, Yanis, had not touched clay since his wife's passing, when grief had dried his hands and heart alike. But this spring, as birds returned to nest above his workshop, he uncovered his tools and washed them clean. The first pot he shaped was small, imperfect, with a slight lean to one side. He set it aside. The second he gave to a neighbor who filled it with lentils and left it at the door of a family newly arrived from the hills. The third he kept, not for sale, for memory. And so his shop opened again, not with announcement, but with quiet continuity. In the valleys of the Alps, shepherds built new pens for lambs born in late frost. The mountain snows had begun to melt with more certainty, forming streams that laced through fields like threads of silver. A boy named Lucas carved a small flute from alder wood and played it while tending the sheep. The melody was clumsy at first, but true. One morning, an eagle passed overhead, casting a shadow that flickered across the rocks. Lucas paused and watched it soar, then played a new tune, slower, deeper, full of sky. He did not know that his father, listening from a ridge above, wept silently into his scarf. To the south, in the hills beyond Jerusalem, wildflowers carpeted the paths once worn bare by fleeing feet. Pilgrims returned, not as crowds, but as solitary walkers, each carrying a different silence. Some whispered prayers, others brought offerings, stones from distant rivers, small bundles of woven cloth, strands of hair from the departed. Ezra, now tall and slender, walked these paths too. He no longer served only at the temple, but as a guide for those who had lost their way. He carried with him a single staff, carved with symbols passed down by his elders: fire, wind, bread, eye, seed. He spoke little. He listened more. One evening he stood with a woman who had journeyed barefoot for 100 miles. She said nothing. He offered her a drink of water and pointed toward a tree just beginning to blossom. That, he said, was here before the darkness. It will be here after us too. In the distant east, where rice paddies once lay dormant beneath ash-filled skies, green began to spread again like a whispered secret. Farmers waded ankle-deep into the flooded fields, bending their backs with reverence. The planting songs, rhythmic, communal, part prayer and part instruction, rose again. A girl named Hanako, whose mother had sung such songs before vanishing into the great sickness, now led the chant. Her voice quavered, then steadied. Each line she remembered, each word returned like an ancestor stepping through mist. Her younger siblings followed her voice, planting in time with the rhythm. The field, once silent, now rippled with movement and melody. In the burned ruins of an old abbey on the Breton coast, a man named Owen collected stones. Each morning he walked along the shore and chose one. Smooth, salt-worn, familiar. He carried them back to the chapel's remains and stacked them, not to rebuild, but to remember. The walls no longer stood, but the outline did. When the tide came in, the sea passed through gently, touching the stones without toppling them. One day, a stranger joined him, a woman with wind-tangled hair and eyes like driftwood. She placed a feather atop the growing altar and said nothing. He nodded. They stood together until night fell. And across the sea, in the green fields of Ire, the Druids returned to their stones. They came not as priests, but as caretakers, brushing moss from carvings, clearing paths with branches, pouring honey into the soil. They did not speak to the gods as they once had, for the silence had changed them. Now they spoke to the land itself. One knelt and whispered to a sapling growing through the crack of an ancient dolmen. "You knew before we did," he said. And in the winds that swept the heather, something old stirred, older than memory, but not beyond hope. The world continued its slow unfolding, not in grandeur, but in tenderness. A return not shouted, but sung softly. A reawakening not of power, but of belonging. The people, having tasted the edge of oblivion, now lived with deeper care. They had learned to love not only the sunrise, but the faint light that came before it. Not only the harvest, but the furrowed ground. Not only survival, but the grace of sharing it. And the earth, ever patient, welcomed them home. In the fertile crescent of the Nile Delta, the water once again carried silt and memory. Its course, long haunted by stagnation and drought, now shimmered with a familiar pulse. Farmers, cautious and reverent, stepped barefoot into the fields where their ancestors had knelt for centuries. They carried not tools at first, but offerings, small jars of honey, rings of dried papyrus, and prayers whispered in the old tongue. Among them was a man named Khafra, whose family had tilled the same plot for 5 generations. During the long twilight, he had lost much, his father to hunger, his son to fever. But now, with the Nile gently rising and the ibis returning to the shallows, he stood in the wet soil once more, his shadow stretched long behind him. He bent and planted one handful of wheat, then another. He did not weep, he sang. In the hill country of Judea, almond trees burst into bloom as if all at once, their white flowers glowing like starlight scattered across the branches. Along narrow paths and stony ridges, shepherds moved their flocks higher, seeking the sweet grass that sprang from cracks in the ancient terraces. The hills, silent for so long, now echoed with the soft bleating of lambs and the rhythmic tapping of staffs. A young shepherd named Shira paused one morning as her flock grazed, captivated by the sight of a lizard sunning itself on a warm rock. She sat beside it, cross-legged, her face turned to the sky. It was the first day she had not worn a cloak, and the sun kissed her shoulders like a benediction. Later she carved a symbol into the rock, a spiral within a spiral. Not a map, but a memory. Far to the north, where fjords cut deep into the land and the sea wind had long kept fire from catching, the people began to burn driftwood again. Whole villages had lived through the dark on salted fish and silence. Now they sat around flames that hissed and popped with stories. The elders spoke of stars that guided lost boats and of bears seen wandering the thawing forests, slimmer but alive. One boy, blond-haired and wide-eyed, asked his grandfather why the sky had hidden for so long. The old man stirred the fire and replied, "Because sometimes the sky needs to rest too, just like us." In the towns of Gaul, new murals began to appear, not painted in grand churches or carved into stone, but drawn in charcoal on the plaster of humble homes. They showed hands holding seeds, women carrying water, children chasing birds. The images were rough, even childlike, but filled with tenderness. One door bore the simple drawing of a loaf of bread with a beam of sunlight above it. Beneath it, a line of verse, "Light rises in the crust." The artist, a woman named Leonie, refused to sign her work. "It belongs to everyone now," she said. "We all survived it." In the heart of the old Roman roads, pilgrims walked once more, not in silence, but in song. From Brindisi to Lyon, from Trier to Santiago, the footpaths bore sandals, boots, bare feet. Some walked for penance, some for promise, some simply because the horizon no longer frightened them. They walked alone, or in pairs, or in clusters that changed with each village. And wherever they passed, they left behind small cairns, stones stacked 3 high. A merchant named Cassian, who had once lost both fortune and family, walked not with goods but with letters. He carried messages written by others, words of reunion, words of forgiveness. He delivered them to places he had never seen, to people he had never known. When asked why, he said, "Because the world stitched itself together with words once. It will again." In the steppes between the Black Sea and the Caspian, wildflowers bloomed in chaotic bursts, color without pattern, beauty without plan. The nomads, returning to lands abandoned, found their old trails marked not by cairns, but by petals. Horses trod lightly. Tents were raised near rivers that now ran free. Songs once sung only at births were sung again. A mother named Arzu, her newborn wrapped in linen dyed with elderberry, sang a lullaby to the night sky. Her voice cracked, not from weakness, but from too many months of silence. Her husband listened, holding their child close, and joined her on the final line. In a cave along the coast of Dalmatia, a hermit emerged after more than 2 years in solitude. His name had been forgotten, even by himself. He stood blinking in the light, his beard tangled, his robe stiff with salt. A group of children gathering mussels spotted him and ran to tell their families. The village greeted him not with celebration, but with warmth. A bath was drawn, clothes were offered. He said nothing for many days, and when he finally spoke, he said only, "The sea still speaks to me, and now, so do you." In Constantinople, the gardens of the great palace were reopened. The roses, though pruned back to near nothing during the cold, bloomed again in clusters of white and blush. Courtiers walked among them with reverent steps. Even the emperor, older now, stood beneath an olive tree and plucked a single leaf, turning it over in his fingers. He gave it to a passing servant and said, "This leaf has seen both darkness and dawn, like us, and in the cloisters of the world, in temples, in sanctuaries, in the spaces carved by hands and breath and longing, candles were no longer lit in mourning, but in gratitude. Each one a prayer not for deliverance, but for gentleness. Each one a reminder that after the longest night, the dawn does not shout, it whispers." And the earth, slowly waking, listened. In the dense woods of the Ardennes, where ancient trees stood like guardians over the mossy floor, a quiet greenness spread like balm. The canopy, thinned by years of storm and stillness, now bathed the undergrowth in filtered light. Ferns unfurled, their curled tips reaching toward the dappled sky. The wind that moved through the forest no longer carried the sharpness of grief. It carried the softness of renewal. At the edge of a clearing, a young woman named Alex knelt beside a fallen log and uncovered a line of mushrooms glowing faintly in the dusk. She touched them gently, whispering their names as her grandmother had taught her: chanterelle, boletus, honeycap. It was the first time in 2 winters that she had seen them return in such numbers. She gathered only what she needed. The rest she left, with a promise spoken low into the roots. In the ruined chapel of St. Eustace, long buried beneath ivy and earth, a band of stonemasons worked in quiet concert. They were not hired by the church nor sent by any noble hand. They came on their own, drawn by some shared instinct, some pull older than coin. Each morning they rebuilt a single arch or swept away the rubble from one apse. Their work was slow, meticulous. Among them was a mute man named Gervain, who carved a symbol above the doorway as the sun broke through a slit in the wall. 2 hands open, palms upward, carved into the stone with surprising grace. No one asked what it meant. Everyone understood. To the far northeast, where the rivers of the Russes had frozen into silence year after year, the ice now cracked with music. The thaw came in bursts, groans, shatters, sudden pools. But it came. Fishing boats were dragged out from storage, patched and set afloat once more. Nets, once brittle with disuse, were mended with careful fingers. On the banks of the Volkhov River, a boy named Yasha cast a line into the water for the first time in his life. His grandfather, toothless and wrapped in wool, sat beside him, watching the ripples. "What will we catch?" the boy asked. The old man smiled. "If not fish, then peace." In the steep olive terraces of Byzantium's southern coast, groves long thought lost to frost began to show shoots from their bases. The trunks, gray and twisted with age, bore signs of life not from their crowns, but from their roots. Gardeners came not with shears, but with songs, humming as they knelt beneath the branches. A woman named Dion, who had once studied medicine before the darkness came, gathered the young leaves and pressed them into a salve for cracked skin. Her sister, blind from birth, helped her by scent alone, sorting herbs by smell and texture. Together they healed what could be healed, and sat quietly with what could not. In the foothills of the Apennines, a group of children planted a garden in the center of their village square. The earth had not been turned in years, but their hands were small and stubborn. They planted peas, radishes, onions, and marigolds, not for their utility, but for their color. They watered with chipped cups and old wine jugs. Each morning, one of them would race to the garden and shout, "It's bigger!" And the others would come running, laughing, touching leaves with reverence. An elder watched from her stoop, her cane across her knees. "The world is teaching them how to tend," she murmured, "and how to be tended." To the west, in the coastal reaches of Lusitania, seabirds returned in flocks, wheeling and diving above the tide. Fishermen watched them with cautious joy. No creature returned to dead waters. In the harbor town of Alasipo, sails bloomed again, pale and trembling against the blue sky. One ship returned from a short voyage with barrels of salted mackerel in a strange unmarked chest. When opened, it revealed letters, dozens of them sealed in wax, protected in oilskin. They were love letters, prayers, confessions, written during the long dark and cast into the sea. The townsfolk gathered to read them aloud in the square. Each letter was anonymous, each one sacred. A widow read a letter aloud that ended, "If the sun returns, I will believe we were forgiven." She folded the parchment and held it to her chest. In the eastern mountains of Anatolia, a young man named Sephir began sculpting animals from clay, not to sell, but to give away. He left them on doorsteps and shrines, on tree stumps. Tiny deer, owls, sheep, even beetles. Each one bore a different posture, some alert, some resting, some in mid-motion. He left no mark of the maker. Children began collecting them. One built a shrine of them on a windowsill. Another lined her sleeping mat with them for dreams. A blind boy carried one in his pocket, rubbing it like a talisman. They called them the remembering creatures. In the reed-lined banks of the Tigris, fireflies returned. For the first time in years, their lights danced above the water in the soft lull of dusk. An old poet named Salim sat beside the reeds with an empty scroll in his lap. He had not written a line since the beginning of the dark year. But that night, he dipped his pen and wrote a single verse. The light that needs no tending is the light that waits to be seen. He did not write more. He folded the parchment and placed it beneath a rock. And in the hidden valley of Sarnaxos, where this long memory had begun, the trees were heavy with buds. Leonidas sat beside his granddaughter beneath the ancient fig tree, its branches stretching wide like arms in prayer. The child pointed at the branches and said, "Look, it's about to happen." He followed her gaze. "Yes," he said, "and this time we are ready to watch it." In the warm lowlands of Hispania, where fields once crumbled under ashen silence, rows of young wheat shimmered in the breeze. Their heads swayed like murmurs of old songs, golden green and full of quiet promise. Farmers walked slowly between them, their footsteps soft, as if afraid to wake a dream. They no longer cursed the sky, nor pleaded with the earth. They simply tended what had grown. A man named Aurelio, once a scribe and now a shepherd, paused in the middle of his field and knelt. He brushed his palm gently over the stalks, remembering the books he had copied by candlelight during the long dusk. He no longer wrote on parchment. Now, his letters lived in rows of grain, in the shape of furrows in the breath of wind. To him, the field was a page, and each seed a word sown with reverence. He whispered to the earth, "I am writing again." In the shadowed coves of the Ionian coast, fishermen had begun to cast nets deeper, bolder. They did not speak of miracles. They did not claim victory. But they had learned the currents anew, watching the birds and trusting their memory. One morning, a boy named Nikos pulled in a net heavy with silver fish. It spilled onto the deck like treasure, writhing and flashing in the sun. His father looked at the haul and said nothing. He only reached into his coat and pulled out a small seashell, white, perfect, and whole, and placed it into the boy's palm. "Keep this," he said, "for days when the sea forgets us again." In the broad plains of Illyria, the grass grew tall enough to sweep the knees of passing deer. Wild horses galloped across open fields with tails high and hooves thundering, unchained by fences, untouched by fear. Along the edge of one meadow, a circle of stones once used for burial had been overgrown. Now it stood cleared and adorned with garlands of dandelion and sage. A girl named Gera came each morning to sit in its center. She brought no offerings. She brought stories, spoken aloud, told to the wind. She told tales of a sun that went missing and a moon that never left, of beasts that vanished and gardens that waited. She did not know who listened, but the stones, warm now in the morning light, held her voice gently. She told them, "I remember everything, so you don't have to." In the temples of Athens, the marble had begun to gleam again, not polished, not cleaned, but kissed by light. The columns, once smudged with smoke and darkened by grief, now wore shadows shaped like olive branches and pigeons in flight. Philosophers returned, not to debate the world's purpose, but to contemplate its survival. One elder named Demetrios stood in the center of the agora and posed a question to the sky. If the earth forgives us, must we learn to forgive it in return? A student wrote his words on a shard of pottery and placed it beneath an olive tree. "Let this be our new record," he said, "the beginning of our second library." To the far east, in the misted mountains of the Hindu Kush, a caravan rested beside a spring long hidden by landslides. The water, cold and clear, gurgled from between mossy stones. One of the travelers, a weaver named Jivan, dipped a strip of indigo cloth into the spring and watched it darken to royal blue. It was the first dye he had made since his looms were buried in snow. He tied the cloth around a tree branch and let it flutter like a banner, not a flag of conquest or country, but of return. Others in the caravan followed his example. One tied a bell, another a ribbon, a third a verse etched into bark. When they left the next morning, the tree bore a coat of memories offered without grief. In the frost-touched steppes near the Caspian, a healer named Dana brewed a tea of cedar, mint, and pine. She carried it to the edge of her village, where elders sat bundled in wool, watching the morning mist burn away. None of them had spoken of the years of loss, but they each took a cup, sipped in silence, and nodded. Dana placed a sprig of dried lavender in the final cup and set it on an empty stool, not for ceremony, for someone missed. And in the deep woods of Albion, where once druids danced in secret groves, children now played in circles of bluebells and foxglove. They sang songs without knowing where they came from, songs their parents did not teach them. One child named Rowan sang alone beneath a hawthorn tree. His voice was high and clear, and the birds paused to listen. When asked who had taught him the song, he answered, "The wind did." In a monastery overlooking the Black Sea, the monks planted grapevines along the terraces again. The roots had survived, buried deep in the dark. Now they reached upward with certainty. Brother Nestor traced each tendril as it grew, recording the direction of every curl in a weathered ledger. He no longer prayed for the sun. He prayed for the patience to watch it return. And on the 7th evening of planting, one of the brothers uncorked the last bottle of the last vintage made before the long winter. They did not drink it quickly. They poured a single cup, passed it hand to hand, and each took one sip. When the last monk finished, he wiped the rim and placed the cup in the center of the table. "Let it breathe," he said. Across the many lands of earth, humanity did not rise in chorus. They rose in small, steady motions, hands in soil, feet on paths, voices lifted not in shouts, but in verses soft as dew. The year was no longer about what had been lost. It had become a year of what would be made again. In the green shadowed valleys of Bavaria, where mist clings low in the mornings and the hills roll like waves of sleeping giants, the meadows had filled with clover. Bees, bold and busy, moved among the blooms with a determination that mirrored the people who had remained. The hives, once silent and collapsed, buzzed again, not loudly but steadily, like a hum from the deep heart of the land. At the edge of one such meadow, a beekeeper named Lot knelt before a wooden hive she had repaired with ash wood and iron nails. Her veil lifted gently in the breeze as she watched her bees return, wings glittering like flecks of amber in the light. She held her breath when one landed on her finger. "They remember the flowers," she whispered, "even when the flowers forget themselves." In the winding streets of Carthage, jasmine bloomed between the cracks of old walls. It crept from forgotten gardens, from the edge of burned courtyards, wrapping columns that had not heard laughter in years. The city had been quiet too long, but now its voice returned in footsteps and small greetings, in market stalls selling cloth dyed once again in madder and indigo. A potter named Bassam shaped vessels with slender necks and wide mouths, his fingers knowing the clay better than they knew his own face in the mirror. For the first time in many months, he etched not names, but verses into the surface, prayers for rain, for love, for forgiveness. Each one he baked in fire and set out under the sun. Buyers came slowly. Friends came more quickly. One child asked, "Will they hold water?" Basim smiled. "Yes, but they're made to hold stories." To the far north, in the ice-flecked harbors of the Skagerrak, the boats began to venture farther out, not to chase whales or fill markets, but simply to feel the deep rhythm of the water again. The oars dipped in time with the calls of seabirds, and nets came back light, but not empty. On one small boat, a father and daughter watched the horizon in silence. She had never seen open sea before, only gray skies and frozen shorelines. When the sun dipped low and cast golden paths across the waves, she whispered, "It looks like it never forgot us." "No," her father said, placing a hand on hers. "It was only waiting." In the mountain passes of the eastern Alps, pilgrims left small carved figures in the hollows of trees, guardian spirits, animals, sleeping faces. Some were made of wood, some of stone, others of clay hardened by fire or sun. No two were the same, but all bore one feature, closed eyes, as if they too were still dreaming. A stonemason named Enzo collected them each spring and placed them in a dry cave above a glacier-fed stream. He did not pray to them, he thanked them. One morning, he found a new figure not made by his hand, an eagle with wings outspread, carved from a pale stone he did not recognize. Beneath it, a single word etched in careful lines, Risorgere, to rise again. In the forests of Bohemia, music returned to the glades. Fiddlers played on stumps and logs, flutes whispered between trees, and the low beat of drums stirred the soil. People gathered not to feast, for food was still scarce, but to dance. Not with grandeur, but with yearning. They danced barefoot on moss and pine needles, in circles, in pairs, alone. One dancer, an old woman named Magda, moved with arms raised to the sky, eyes closed. Her steps were slow, deliberate, like weaving a thread into time itself. Later, she told her grandson, "When we dance, the dead dance too, and the unborn." In a quiet monastery near the Rhone, Brother Emile copied ancient proverbs onto scraps of wood, having run out of parchment. He used an old stylus, dipped not in ink, but in wine. The letters came faint, nearly invisible, but he knew they would darken with age. He left the scraps in doorways, under bowls, inside shoes. One read, "A cracked vessel still carries light." He never told anyone what he was doing. But one morning, as he swept the chapel steps, he found a scrap of wood not his own. It read, "So do we." And in the northern isles, where the wind never fully calms and the sea always breathes, families rebuilt their longhouses. Children shaped driftwood into ships. Women wove nets with hands that remembered knots even after all the fish had gone. And elders told stories of how the stars once vanished and returned. A girl named Mariade traced constellations into the sand with a stick, waiting for nightfall. Her grandfather pointed to the sky as dusk deepened. "That one," he said, "was the first to return." She squinted. "I don't see it." "You will," he replied. "They always come back, one by one." In the quiet garden of a ruined villa outside Ravenna, roses bloomed against scorched stone. They had not been planted. They had found their way back. A scholar named Antonia knelt by them, brushing dust from petals. She had studied the old books, the treatises, the edicts, the histories, and found them all lacking for this moment. So she began a new book, not on war, not on kings, but on how the earth forgave. She wrote in the margins, "We did not rebuild the world. We remembered how to belong to it." And far across the hills beyond river and ruin, the wind carried a scent no one had smelled in years, fresh rain on sun-warmed stone. It came slowly, but it came. In the low, sun-drenched plains of Thrace, the barley stood waist-high, swaying with the ease of a world relearning grace. The wind moved through it in waves, like breath through a sleeping giant. Farmers walked between the rows barefoot, not to measure growth, but to feel the soil beneath them, warm, pliant, alive. Among them was a boy named Marcos, no more than 12, who carried a sling across his back and a satchel filled with stones polished smooth by the river. He did not hunt with them. He placed each one at the base of a barley stalk, murmuring to them as if they were roots in need of stories. His mother called him strange. His grandfather called him a shepherd of silence. When the sun dipped low and cast gold on the fields, Marcos whispered, "Grow tall. The sky is listening now." In the soft hills of Tuscany, a painter returned to her abandoned studio. Her name was Viola, and for 2 years she had painted nothing. No walls, no cloth, no faces. The pigments had dried and the brushes curled, but the walls still held light, and the windows, though dusty, framed the countryside like paintings themselves. She swept the floor with rosemary branches. She lit a lamp. Then she ground a pinch of ochre with olive oil and drew a single stroke on canvas. It was a curved line, imperfect, warm, like the slope of a shoulder or the lip of a bowl. She paused, then another, then another. By morning, a figure was forming, a woman cradling a loaf of bread. Viola smiled, though no one saw it. She did not speak to her work. She simply painted it into being, as if drawing memory out of the dark. In the markets of Alexandria, figs returned in woven baskets, ripe and purple, their skins beginning to split with sweetness. The air, once thick with the smell of burning oil and damp rot, now carried spices, fresh cut cedar, and salt from the sea. Traders moved again with purpose, their voices low, their gestures generous. One trader, a man named Rami, arrived with a cart not of goods but of books, scrolls saved during the long dim months, wrapped in cloth, protected in clay pots. He unrolled them one by one, reading titles aloud in soft reverence. The shape of rain, the weight of dust, the mercy of stones. Children gathered around him, listening. When asked if they could read them, he shook his head gently and said, "No, but I can read them to you." And so he did. To the west, in a sunlit glen of Brittany, bees built a hive in the crook of a hollow tree. The villagers, uncertain whether to disturb them, sought the advice of an old woman who had once kept bees before the cold took everything. She came with slow steps and soft breath, knelt before the hive, and simply listened. Then she stood and declared, "They have chosen us again." She taught the children to hum softly as they passed, so the bees would know their songs. Honey was not yet gathered. That would come later. First, trust. In the plains near the Danube's bend, a blacksmith named Petar reopened his forge. He had once made weapons, blades, arrowheads, shields, but now he made hinges, plowshares, bells. His hammer rang through the village like a returning heartbeat. At dusk, he quenched the metal and carved a mark on each tool, a crescent moon beneath a rising sun. A traveler asked him what it meant. Pedar looked up from his anvil, sweat streaked on his brow, and said, "That we survived the night, and now we work." In the temple ruins of Delphi, pilgrims left offerings once more, not of gold or incense, but of hands pressed to stone. They came barefoot with open palms, whispering questions not for prophecy, but for permission. One woman placed a single olive pit on the altar and said, "This is all I have, but I will plant it." The wind, slow and steady, moved through the columns. A bird nested in the broken cornice. Grass grew between the marble blocks, soft as breath. In the forests beyond the Rhine, storytellers walked again from village to village, carrying not scrolls, but memory. They sat by fires, on stumps, at doorways, and spoke not of kings or conquest, but of endurance. Their tales were strange, of mothers who kept gardens by starlight, of animals who spoke only during the long cold, of firelight that wandered through the woods like a friend. A listener in one village asked, "Are they true?" The storyteller, a man called Gero, answered, "They are true enough to need telling." In the highlands of Armenia, the old shrine of Arshak still stood, stones now moss-covered and fireless. But each morning, someone came, no longer one man, but many. They brought herbs, salt, cups of water. No one led the ritual. They simply knelt, touched the stones, and left in silence. One morning, a child left a painted stone with a sun drawn on it, bright yellow and wide. It did not fade, even after rain, and in Sarnaxos, Leontius no longer walked with a cane. His hands, though crooked, still tilled the garden. His granddaughter read to him from a book she had found beneath the monastery's floorboards, tales of old cities, bright festivals, and maps of stars long hidden. Each evening they watched the horizon together, not for omens, but for wonder. A fig had ripened on the tree beside them. He plucked it gently, split it in two, and gave her half. She bit into it, smiled, and said, "It's sweeter than I remember." Leontius nodded, chewing slowly. "It waited for us, that's all." The world, like the fruit, had not turned bitter from the long dark. It had only waited for the right moment to ripen. In the shadowed cliffs of northern Anatolia, rain fell for the first time in many days, not in sheets or torrents, but in a soft, rhythmic drizzle that felt like fingers on the roof of the world. The stone paths glistened, lichen darkened to emerald. Caves long sealed by dryness opened again with the scent of wet earth and the promise of cool air. A goatherd named Elvin led her animals along the upper ridge, watching how the droplets clung to their fur, how their hooves pressed fresh patterns into the mud. She found a spring she had forgotten, trickling clear between the roots of a bent pine. She knelt, cupped her hands, and drank. It tasted of iron, moss, and memory. "It's still here," she whispered to the wind. "Still here." In the grasslands east of the Dniester, bonfires lit the night, not as signals of danger, but as beacons of reunion. Families who had scattered now sat in circles, sharing flatbread, lentils, boiled eggs. No one spoke of where they had been. Instead, they told riddles, sang songs, and let silence stretch between them without fear. A boy named Toma stood and danced alone, spinning with arms raised and eyes closed. Someone handed him a tambourine. Another joined with a flute made from river reeds. By the end of the night, they had made music from nothing but what they carried and what they remembered. The fire cracked. The stars emerged. No one went inside. To the west, along the banks of the Loire, vineyards once thought barren began to yield grapes, small, clustered tightly, but bursting with sweetness. The vintners harvested them with gentle hands, whispering blessings before every cut. The wine pressed that year was not meant for trade. It was not bottled. It was poured into shared cups and passed between neighbors. An old woman named Celeste toasted the harvest with water from the same well her grandmother had drawn from. She added a drop of wine to it and drank. "For those who taught us thirst," she said, "and those who taught us waiting." In the southern deserts of Syria, the caravans moved again beneath the stars, camels swaying like ships at sea. They bore salt, myrrh, leather, and song. The oases they passed, once dry, then feared, now sacred, were greeted with reverence and rest. Fires were lit not only for warmth, but to signal safety. At one such fire, a merchant named Omar told the story of a falcon who had lost its wings, only to grow new ones of light. A boy asked if falcons could really do that. Omar looked to the flames. If not in flesh, then in memory. And memory flies farther. In the hills outside Petra, children trace their fingers along the ancient stone facades, finding coolness in their cracks and echoes in their corners. One girl found a small niche with a lump of wax hardened like amber. She brought it to her grandmother, who smelled it and said, "This was once light." That night, they melted it down with olive oil and wick and lit it. The flame was brief, but golden. It flickered long enough to show the lines of the grandmother's face and the wonder in the child's eyes. In the fjords of the northern reaches, the icebergs drifted farther out, revealing beaches strewn with seaweed and driftwood. The fishermen returned with salted cod, and the women carved spoons and bowls from the branches carried ashore. Meals were shared again under the low sky, thick with mist, but no longer heavy with sorrow. A woman named Salve carved a bowl shaped like a whale's back, and on the inside, etched with a bone tool, she wrote, "We eat together again." To the southeast, near the ruins of Jericho, olive groves bore fruit again. The trees had never died. They had waited, buried in dust, their roots sunk deep into memory. A young man named Naim climbed one tree at dawn and sat among its branches, holding the first olive of the season in his palm. He rolled it between his fingers, felt its weight, and whispered a blessing he had not spoken in years. Then he descended, pressed it into oil with a stone, and rubbed it onto the cracked leather of his father's sandals. "This will carry us farther," he said. In the halls of learning in Constantinople, students returned with parchment made from sewn-together scraps, ink brewed from ash and berry, and quills cut from broken feathers. They did not begin with numbers or law. They began with the words of the past. One young girl read aloud, "Even in darkness, a lamp remembers flame." Her teacher closed his eyes and nodded. "Now let's remember the lamp." And across the waters on a green island wrapped in mist, a single monastery bell rang at noon. It had not tolled for years, not for war, not for hunger, not for mourning. It rang for no one in particular. It rang simply because it could. The monk who rang it, Brother Xian, said afterward to no one in particular, "The sound is smaller now, but the silence that follows is kinder." In Sarnaxos, the fig tree bore more fruit than it ever had. Leontius sat beneath it with his granddaughter, both of them older now, both of them quieter. A breeze moved through the garden. The scent of thyme, soil, and summer rose around them like a shawl. She asked him, "Do you think the world knows we're still here?" He smiled without turning. "Yes, that's why it keeps growing." In the hills that cradled Sarnaxos, dawn stretched its gold fingers over the rooftops, touching terracotta and olive branch alike. A hush rested over the valley, not from absence, but from fullness. The world no longer held its breath. It breathed deeply, rhythmically, as if remembering itself after a long, hard sleep. The birds returned not in flocks, but in pairs. Bees moved with quiet confidence, and the light, that long-lost companion, had become familiar again. Leontius walked the garden path with a cane he no longer needed, but carried nonetheless, out of memory, out of respect. His granddaughter skipped ahead, humming a tune that had no words, only warmth. She paused at the fig tree, placing her hand on its bark. Then she turned to him. "Tell me again," she asked, "what it was like before the sun came back." He looked past her, to the hills, the olive groves, the sea beyond. "It wasn't a silence you could enjoy," he said slowly. "It was the kind that took things from you, color, time, laughter. It made every breath feel borrowed." She tilted her head. "And now?" He smiled, the lines around his eyes folding like old pages. "Now we breathe with interest." Beyond the garden, down the winding slope into the village square, a gathering had begun. Not a festival, not a market, but something older. Families brought bowls of grain, bundles of rosemary, loaves shaped like suns. No speeches were given. No flags were flown. People stood, sat, touched hands, exchanged food, exchanged silence. They did not speak of what they had endured. They simply existed together, as if presence itself were the offering. A child traced circles in the dust with a stick. An elder braided dried flowers into a crown and placed it on a sleeping infant's head. Somewhere near the well, someone began to sing, a song of threading, of mending, of gathering light. The villagers joined one by one, each voice adding warmth, not volume. It was a song without a beginning, one they had known long before they ever heard it. Far across the land, in cities still rebuilding, In farms where rows bent to the wind, in forests where the trunks now stood taller, the song was sung in different forms. It lived in the rhythm of hoes breaking soil, of paint brushed across stone, of loom threads drawn taut. In Constantinople, an old scholar translated one of the last scrolls found buried beneath the imperial library. It read, "Light does not return, it waits, and when we are ready, we remember how to see." In the Nile Delta, a young girl dropped a single flaxseed into her grandmother's palm. "For next year," she said. Her grandmother kissed her forehead. "For always." In the steppes, a herd of horses thundered across the plain, wild and unbranded. A boy watched from a rise and raised his hand in salute, not to tame them, but to bless them. In a stone circle on the western edge of Ire, the Druids lit a fire of peat and herbs, not to summon anything, but to thank what had already arrived. As smoke spiraled upward, a voice said softly, "This is not the return of the world. This is our return to it." And so it was, not with monuments, not with victories, but with the everyday holiness of survival, of seeds planted not in fear, but in hope, of stories told not to warn, but to comfort, of bread broken not out of need, but out of love. The year 536 had torn open something deep and unspoken. It had shown the fragility of light, the weight of cold, and the silence that can swallow even memory. But in its shadow, the people had become something else, not greater, not purer, but truer. They learned to measure time not by kings or wars, but by the return of small things, the hum of bees, the tilt of petals, the voice of a child who had never known the dark. And now they no longer asked, "When will things be as they were?" Instead, they asked, "How shall we live now that we remember what matters?" In the fading warmth of that summer evening, Leontius sat with his granddaughter beneath the fig tree. She placed her head on his shoulder, and together they watched the stars appear one by one. Not feared, not forgotten, simply returned.